The hall was too loud and too bright, and Serafina Cole wanted nothing more than to be somewhere else. She stood near the far wall of the grand gathering hall, holding a cup of warm cider she had not touched, watching 200 wolves move around each other, like pieces on a board she did not understand. The annual Alpha gathering happened once a year, and every unmated wolf above the age of 20 was expected to attend. Her pack elder, a stout woman named Doris, had put Serafina's name forward without asking. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, Serafina had packed a bag, taken a 4-hour bus ride to the mountain city of Ironvale, and spent 2 nights in a shared room at a guest lodge trying to convince herself this would not be a waste of time. She was 21 years old. She had olive skin, dark brown hair that she kept in a low knot most days, and eyes the color of black coffee. She was not short, but she was not tall either. She was average in every way that the wolves in this room seemed to care about, which was why she stayed near the wall and watched rather than moved through the crowd. She had grown up in Caldwell Creek, a border pack so small that most of the 7 wolf territories did not even put it on their maps. The pack had 43 members, a bakery, a veterinary clinic, and a post office that was open only 3 days a week. It was not the kind of place that produced warriors or council members or lunas. It produced bakers and healers and people who fixed fences and kept quiet. Serafina was a healer. She had been learning from the pack's elder healer, a patient old man named Gerald, since she was 14. She knew how to set a broken bone, how to reduce a fever, how to identify 42 plants by smell, and how to sit with someone in pain without making it worse. These were the things she was good at. Standing in a gold-lit hall full of powerful wolves, while violin music drifted from a string quartet in the corner, was not one of them. She was watching a group of young betas arguing near the food table when the room changed. She did not see it happen. She felt it, a shift in the air, like the pressure drop before a storm. The conversations around her did not stop, but they slowed. Something heavy and electric moved through the crowd, from the direction of the main entrance, and people stepped aside, the way tall grass bends when wind passes through it. Serafina turned. She saw him for the first time from across a room of 200 people, and her chest did something she had no word for. Kalen Voss was 30 years old. He was the Alpha King, the sole ruler of all 7 wolf territories, a position that had not existed for 300 years before his rise. He had taken it at 26 after a long territorial war that most wolves did not like to discuss in detail. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he moved with the kind of stillness that meant he had never once in his life needed to prove himself by moving fast. His hair was dark, his jaw was hard, he wore no crown and no ceremonial sash. He wore a dark coat and leather boots, and the expressions on the faces of every wolf near him told Serafina everything she needed to know about how much power he carried, without trying. She had seen his photograph in the territory news. She had heard stories. None of it had prepared her for the way the mate bond pulled at the center of her chest, like a hook catching on a cord that had been there all along without her knowing. It was not romantic. It was not soft. It was like gravity. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed through her nose. This could not be right. There was some mistake. The bond could be triggered by proximity and emotional readiness, and she had been anxious all night, and maybe that was confusing her system, and this was almost certainly not real. He stopped walking. 40 feet away from her, in the middle of the hall with 200 wolves around him, Kalen Voss stopped moving. He was not looking at her. His head was turned slightly, and then slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who already knew what they were going to find, he turned. His eyes found her. Serafina stopped breathing. He looked at her the way you look at a word you recognize but cannot place, something familiar inside something unexpected. His face did not change. His expression stayed controlled. But he kept looking at her, and she kept looking at him, and the cord between them pulled tighter, and the room around them had gone very, very quiet. She became aware that people were watching. Not everyone, but enough. The wolves nearest to Kalen had stepped back a half step. His 2 bodyguards, flanking him on either side, had turned outward to give him space. His personal advisor, a sharp-faced man in a gray suit whom Serafina recognized from the news as Corbin, was leaning close to say something, but Kalen was not listening. He was walking toward her. Serafina's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her palms. She kept her face as still as she could. She would not make this worse by falling apart. She watched him cross the distance between them with that unhurried stride, and she stood up straighter, and she waited. He stopped 2 feet from her. This close, the mate bond was not a pull anymore. It was a roar. It moved through her like heat, like certainty, like something ancient and done settling into place. She could smell him, cedar and cold air, and something dark and clean underneath. His eyes were a strange amber green, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not read. She thought he was going to speak. Instead, he looked at her for a long, still moment. And then something happened behind his eyes, a door closing, a decision made so quickly she almost missed it. He turned around. He walked back to his advisor. He said something in a low voice. Corbin nodded once. Then Kalen moved on into the crowd as though nothing had happened, and people stepped aside for him again. And in 30 seconds he was on the other side of the room, laughing quietly at something a pack alpha in a red jacket had said to him. Serafina stood against the wall with a full cup of cider, and a feeling in her chest like a bruise. Around her, conversations had resumed. People were pretending they had not seen. But 2 young women nearby exchanged a look, and an older wolf near the food table shook his head slowly, and Serafina understood that what had just happened was not private. It had happened in front of witnesses. The Alpha King had felt the mate bond, walked toward her, looked at her, and walked away. She set her cup down on the window ledge behind her. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. She stayed at the gathering for another 2 hours, because leaving immediately would have been an announcement. She spoke to a few people. She tried the food. She listened to someone from the 3rd Territory talk about their pack's new water treatment project. She was present and polite, and she did not look across the room once. When she finally left, she walked to the guest lodge, in cold mountain air, and lay down on the narrow bed in the shared room, while her 2 lodgemates slept, and she stared at the ceiling. She did not cry. She was too shocked to cry. The mate bond was still there. A dim ache now instead of a roar, the way a fire sounds from a room away. She had always known, in the abstract way that all wolves know, that the bond was real, and that it could happen. She had not known it would feel like this. She had not known it would feel like being given something and having it taken back in the same breath. She told herself it was fine. People were rejected. It happened. Wolves rejected mates for all kinds of reasons, especially at the higher levels of pack society, where political matches were more important than fated ones. She was from a border pack of 43 people. He was the king of 7 territories. This made logical sense. This was not a surprise. She believed most of that. She fell asleep before she finished convincing herself of the last part. The next morning, she was eating breakfast at the lodge's common table when Corbin walked in. He did not sit. He stood near the doorway in his gray suit and looked at Serafina with the polite, empty expression of a man delivering a message he had no personal feelings about. "Miss Cole," he said. Her name in his mouth was flat and final, the way a stamp sounds on a document. "Yes," she said. "The Alpha King has made a formal determination regarding last night's perceived bond connection." He used the word perceived. She noticed that. "He wishes me to convey that he does not intend to act on it. You will be removed from the potential records and will not be contacted further regarding any bond-related process." The table had gone quiet. 3 other wolves were sitting there. They were all looking at their plates. "He also asks," Corbin continued, "that you sign a non-disclosure form before you depart today, stating that you will not speak publicly about the event. A copy will be left at the front desk." Serafina set down her fork. "No," she said. Corbin blinked. "I'm sorry? I will not sign it." She picked her fork back up. "He can refuse the bond. That is his right. I have no intention of speaking about it to anyone, but I will not sign a form that treats a private experience like a liability. You can tell him that." There was a very long pause. "Miss Cole," Corbin said, with slightly more edge now, "I would encourage you to consider." "Thank you," Serafina said clearly, "for delivering the message." Corbin left. The 3 wolves at the table stayed quiet for another 30 seconds, and then one of them, a young man with a shaved head and kind eyes, said very softly, "Good for you." Serafina did not respond. She finished her breakfast. She went upstairs, packed her single bag, and checked out of the lodge. She was waiting for the bus back to Caldwell Creek when her phone buzzed. It was her pack elder, Doris, calling to ask how the gathering went. Serafina stood in the thin mountain sunlight and told her it was fine, and there was nothing to report. "Did you meet anyone?" Doris asked, hopeful in the particular way older pack wolves are hopeful about young, unmated females. "No," Serafina said, "no one worth mentioning." That was the first lie she had told in years, and it sat uncomfortably in her mouth for the whole 4-hour bus ride home. By the time she reached Caldwell Creek, the sun was setting and the pack bakery was closed, and the streets were quiet and familiar and small, and she walked to her apartment above the healer's office with her bag on her shoulder, and unlocked the door and went inside. She stood in her kitchen for a long time, without turning on the light. The mate bond was still there, quieter now, far away, like a sound from the bottom of a well. It did not hurt the way she had expected. It was more like the place where something used to be, a gap where warmth should have been. She thought about the way he had looked at her, not the moment of recognition, which had been enormous and obvious. The moment after, the door closing, the decision. He had felt it the same as she had, and he had chosen no, and he had sent his advisor to deliver the news the next morning with a form to sign. She turned on the light. She put the kettle on. She changed out of her travel clothes. She sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea and her notebook, and she wrote out a list, the way she always did when she needed to make something clear. The first line said, "He refused the bond." The second line said, "That is his choice, and it is done." The third line said, "I am going home tomorrow, and I will not think about this again." She underlined the third line twice. She closed the notebook. She drank her tea. She went to bed. She did not know yet that fate rarely agrees with the plans we write in notebooks at kitchen tables. She did not know that the bond had already done what it intended to do, in that one long electric moment in the gold-lit hall. She did not know that walking away from Ironvale would not be as simple as a bus ride home. She would find out in 3 weeks. But that night, she slept. And her sleep was quiet, and her dreams were nothing she remembered, and the apartment above the healer's office was exactly as she had left it, small and warm and hers, and she was grateful for that much at least. Outside, the Caldwell Creek streets were dark and still. The bakery's sign creaked in the wind. The creek at the edge of town moved over its stones with a low, constant murmur. Nothing in the town knew what had happened in Ironvale, and nothing expected that it would matter. It would matter. It would change everything. But not yet. For now, she was just home. 3 weeks later, Serafina was sitting on the bathroom floor of her apartment above the healer's office, holding a small plastic stick, and the world was rearranging itself around her, in a way she was not prepared for. She had been tired for 10 days. She had told herself it was the emotional weight of the gathering, the bus ride, the disrupted routine. She had told herself it was the long hours she had been putting in at the healer's office, covering for Gerald, who had caught a cold. She had told herself many things, and none of them had been this. She looked at the test result for a very long time. Then she got up off the floor, washed her hands, and went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. She did this because she needed something to do with her hands, and because she had found over the years that the act of making tea gave her enough time to let a shock become a fact. By the time the kettle had boiled and she had poured the water and the tea had steeped and cooled enough to drink, she had accepted it. She was carrying the Alpha King's child. Or children. She did not know that yet. That would come later, confirmed at a clinic 40 miles from Caldwell Creek where no one knew her name. She sat at the kitchen table and thought it through with the same methodical care she gave to difficult healing cases. The facts first, then the options, then the decision. Gerald had taught her that. Facts, options, decision. In that order, always. The fact was, she was pregnant. The fact was, the father was Kalen Voss, who had rejected their mate bond publicly and sent his advisor with a non-disclosure form the next morning. The fact was, she had not signed that form. The fact was, she was 21 years old. She lived in a border pack of 43 people, and she worked as a healer's apprentice. The options were fewer than she would have liked. She could contact Kalen and tell him. She stayed with that option for 30 seconds before setting it aside. He had made his position clear. He had not simply walked away from her privately. He had sent official word through an advisor and documented it in the records. Whatever he felt for her, it was not something he was willing to act on, and bringing him news of a pregnancy would not change what he was. It might make things worse. It would certainly make them complicated in ways she could not control. She could tell her pack. She stayed with that option for a little longer. Doris would be supportive in her way, but the pack was small, and the story would move through 43 people in under a day. Questions would follow. Who was the father? Why had she not said anything after the gathering? Why was she not contacting him? The pack had a right to know their members' situations, but Serafina's situation involved the Alpha King, and once that was known, it would not be her situation anymore. It would be everyone's situation. The territories would get involved. Kaylin's council would get involved. Her child, or children, would be born into a legal and political argument before they took their first breath. The third option was to leave. She held this one carefully, turned it over, looked at its edges. Leaving meant losing Gerald's mentorship, losing the familiar streets and the bakery, and the creek, and the 43 people she had grown up with. It meant starting from nothing, somewhere no one knew her. It meant doing this alone. She had been doing most things alone since she was 15, and her parents had moved to the Eastern Territories for work, and the distance had grown into something permanent and quiet. She was used to alone. She was not afraid of it. She was afraid of what happened to her child, in a world where its father's council held power over every pack in every territory. She was afraid of courts and claims, and the child being pulled into a life they had not chosen. She was afraid, if she was honest with herself, of giving Kaylin Voss any more power over her than he already had. She finished her tea, she rinsed the cup. She went to bed, and lay in the dark, and let the fear move through her, without arguing with it. Because she had also learned that trying to talk yourself out of fear, before you have let it finish, usually made it worse. In the morning, she made her decision. She gave Gerald 2 weeks' notice, and told him she was moving to be closer to her parents. Gerald was 78, and kind, and he did not press her. He shook her hand, and told her she was the best apprentice he had trained in 30 years, and he hoped wherever she ended up was good to her. She thanked him, and did not cry until she was outside, and walking down the street in the wind, where no one could see. She told Doris she needed a change, and that she was grateful for everything the pack had given her. Doris hugged her, and said they would always be her family, and that her name would stay on the pack register, as a distant member for as long as she wanted it. Serafina was more grateful for that than she said. She left Caldwell Creek on a gray Tuesday morning, with a backpack, a duffel bag, 2 boxes of healing supplies, and $3,000 in savings. She took a bus north, then west, then another bus further north, through forests that grew denser and darker as the elevation rose. She found Asheville by accident, the way people find things that were always meant for them. The bus had made an unscheduled stop in the small mountain town, because the road further north was iced over, and while the driver waited for word on whether the route would clear, Serafina got off and walked a block to stretch her legs. The town smelled like pine and wood smoke. The mountains above it were enormous, and white-capped and very still. A woman was sweeping the steps of a small building, with a hand-painted sign that read, Asheville Community Healer. A man was stacking firewood outside a hardware store. A child in a red coat was chasing a dog around a lamppost. Serafina stood in the middle of the main street and looked at the mountains and breathed in the cold air. And something settled in her chest that had not been settled in 3 weeks. She did not get back on the bus. She found a room at a boarding house run by a wolf family, the kind of older wolf couple who asked few questions and provided thick blankets and meals on a shared table. She paid for 1 week, then another. She found out that Gerald's clinic was not the only place healing knowledge was valued. The woman with the hand-painted sign was an elder healer named Nora who was looking for an assistant and was willing to train someone who already had a foundation. Serafina presented her supply boxes and her knowledge, and Nora hired her on a trial basis starting Monday. By the end of the 2nd month, she had a small rented cottage at the edge of the forest, a growing reputation in Asheville, and a belly that was beginning to be visible in her looser shirts. Nora knew she was pregnant before Serafina told her. Healer's instinct. She said nothing and asked nothing until Serafina came to her herself, which was on a quiet Thursday afternoon, when the clinic was empty, and the cold outside made the windows fog at the edges. I don't have anyone, Serafina said. She was not asking for pity. She was stating a logistical fact, the way she would state that a patient had no family in the area. There's no partner. The father is not in the picture. I need to know if I can count on support here, or if I should make different arrangements. Nora was a small woman, with white hair and enormous hands, that had delivered more pups than she could count. She looked at Serafina over the top of her reading glasses and said, "You are not the first young woman to come to Ashvale alone, and you will not be the last. You count on me, you count on this town. That is the arrangement." Serafina had nodded, professional, contained. She had gone home that evening and let herself cry for the first time since the bathroom floor. She was not crying from sadness exactly. She was crying from relief, and from exhaustion, and from the strange, fierce love she already felt for the lives growing inside her, which she had learned by this point were two lives, two heartbeats confirmed at a clinic in the next town over, a discovery that had stopped her breath for a full 30 seconds before she started to laugh. Twins, too. She had laughed alone in the examination room for a little longer than was probably appropriate, and then she had composed herself and asked the clinic's healer for the full prenatal care plan, and she had written everything down in her notebook. Two lives meant two sets of everything, two names, two futures that were hers to shape, two people who would never in their lives hear the word refused from someone who was supposed to choose them. She named them in her 7th month, lying in the cottage listening to the forest settle in the dark. Riven, for the older one, Calum, for the second. She did not know yet which would be which. She would know when she met them. The birth was long and difficult, and attended by Nora and one of the boarding house couple's daughters, a capable young woman named Clara, who had delivered pups before and had steady hands. It happened in February, in the cottage, in the early hours of the morning, when the snow outside was silent and deep. Serafina worked through it, the way she worked through everything, deliberately, breathing, not fighting what could not be fought. When it was done, and she was holding both of them, one in each arm, she sat very still for a long time. They were small and perfect and furious about being born, as most new pups are. They had her dark hair, they had his jaw. She noticed that, and felt something complicated about it, and then set the complication aside. They were here, they were well. That was everything. Nora washed her hands at the basin and said, quietly, "They are strong, Serafina. Both of them, stronger than most." "I know," Serafina said. She did not say how she knew. Nora did not ask. In the early weeks, she learned their differences the way you learn the rhythms of a new place. Riven was first in everything, first to cry, first to quiet, first to look directly at her face and seem to actually see her. He had a way of turning his head toward sound that was very precise and very watchful. Calum was calmer, heavier in her arms, slower to announce himself but longer in his attentions, the kind of quiet that was not absence but depth. They were both extraordinary, and she was aware of this not with pride, though she felt that too, but with a kind of careful alertness. She had been a healer's apprentice long enough to know that extraordinary pups sometimes drew extraordinary attention, and she was not ready for attention. She learned to live quietly. She made her work at the clinic the center of her days. She introduced the boys to the town gradually, in the boarding house yard first, then the main street, then the forest paths she walked in the evenings. Ashvale welcomed them the way it had welcomed her, without fuss, with practical kindness, with the understanding that people who came to mountain towns often had stories they would share when they were ready. She shared nothing about their father. If anyone noticed that two boys from an Omega-born mother were developing with the kind of confident solidity usually seen only in alpha bloodlines, they were polite enough not to say it directly. Nora noticed. She said nothing. The old wolf elder at the edge of town, a man named Owen who had lived in Ashvale for 60 years, noticed when Riven growled at a stranger who had walked too close to the cottage without announcing himself. Owen looked at the boy carefully, then at Serafina. She met his gaze steadily. He looked away first. She built a life, brick by brick, choice by choice, the way people build things when they have no safety net and no one to catch them if they fall. She stocked the cottage with herbs and salves and reference texts. She learned every plant that grew within 3 miles of the town. She built a reputation for being thorough and honest, and willing to sit with hard cases when other healers had given up. She made real enough money that she stopped worrying about money every day, and started worrying about it only twice a week, and then once a week, and eventually only when the winter stretched long. The boys grew. They were healthy and loud and full of opinions. By the time they were 2.5, they had made friends with every child in Ashvale and several of the adults. By the time they were 3, They could name 20 plants by sight, knew the paths around the cottage better than Serafina did, and had developed the habit of finishing each other's sentences in a way that made visitors blink. She was happy, in the specific way you can be happy when you have built something real with your own hands. It was not the happiness she had imagined when she was 15 and thinking about the future in vague, bright shapes. It was something better. It was earned. She did not think about Kalen Voss every day. She thought about him sometimes when she saw the particular set of Riven's jaw, or when Calem's eyes caught the light a certain way, or when she filed the quarterly birth registration with the territory office and marked the father's field as unknown, which was not true, but was the only word she had found that would keep her children safe. Unknown, as if he were a mystery, as if he were something she had not stood 2 feet from in a gold-lit hall, while the whole world rearranged itself. She marked the field. She filed the form. She went home to her children. That was enough. For now, for the life she had made in the cold and quiet mountains of Ashvale, it was more than enough. The morning Riven and Calem shifted for the first time, Serafina was in the kitchen making porridge and not watching them closely enough. They were 18 months old. No wolf pup shifted that young. The youngest recorded first shift in the territories had been at 22 months, and that child had come from 2 lines of pure alpha blood on both sides, going back 4 generations. Serafina knew this because she had read every healing text Nora owned, and developmental milestones in wolf pups were covered in 2 full chapters. She heard a sound from the living room she did not recognize, not crying, not laughter, something lower and more uncertain, like a question asked in a language being used for the first time. She left the porridge and went to the doorway. Riven was crouched on the rug with his hands splayed flat against it, and his eyes were gold. Not the warm hazel brown they had been since birth. Gold, bright and clear as sunlight through glass. His small body was trembling, not from fear but from something building inside it, something looking for a way out. Calem was sitting 3 feet away with his knees pulled to his chest, watching his brother with an expression of intense, calm interest, as though he were watching something unfold that he had somehow already expected. Serafina crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched beside Riven. She put her hands on his shoulders, steady and warm, the way she had been taught to touch a patient who was frightened. "I'm here," she said. "I'm right here. Let it come. Don't fight it." She had no idea if an 18-month-old pup could understand those words or follow that instruction. It did not matter. The tone was what mattered. She kept her voice low and level, the way you speak to someone standing at the edge of something large. The shift lasted 40 seconds. Serafina had seen adults shift many times, and it was never small or quiet. It was a complete physical transformation that the body performed through effort, and it was, in the formal language of healer texts, an involuntary-voluntary process, meaning the wolf's nature drove it, but the person's state of mind shaped how it went. In a child, doing it for the first time, without training or preparation, she had expected pain. She had expected panic. There was neither. Riven shifted with the concentration of someone solving a puzzle, brow furrowed, jaw tight, and then he was a small, pale silver pup sitting on the rug where her son had been. He shook his whole body the way a dog shakes off water. Then he looked up at her with those gold eyes and made a sound that was half a bark and half something she could only call indignant. She laughed before she could stop herself. Calem shifted 12 minutes later, in the same deliberate, focused way, and where Riven was silver, Calem was dark gray, almost charcoal, and where Riven had been indignant about the whole thing, Calem sat very still in his pup form and simply looked around the room, as if cataloging it from this new angle. They shifted back on their own, together, within a minute of each other, and then Riven crawled onto Serafina's lap and put his head on her shoulder, and she sat on the living room floor, holding both of them for a long time, while the porridge cooled in the kitchen, and the winter light came through the window. She told Nora the next day. Nora put down her pen and looked at her, with eyes that had seen a great deal, and were now seeing something they had not expected. 18 months, Nora said. Yes. Both of them. Yes. Nora was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I won't ask questions I don't need the answers to, but I want you to understand that I know what early shifting of this kind indicates, and I am telling you now, with no judgment and no pressure, that if there ever comes a time when you need to talk to someone about what you're carrying, I'm here." I know, Serafina said. Thank you. She went home and sat with the weight of what Nora had not said. An alpha's blood did not guarantee early shifting, but it made it significantly more likely. And dual early shifting in twins from the same birth, with those eye colors, with that control, with that calm, was not something that happened in ordinary families. Owen, the elderly wolf elder, had known when Riven growled at the stranger. Nora had known since the birth, probably. Other people in Ashvale would begin to know, and she could not stop that, but she could choose how she responded to it. She chose to say nothing and do everything. She began teaching the boys with the same methodical care she brought to healing. Not wolf skills, not yet. They were discovering those on their own, with the confidence of pups who had never been told what they could and could not do. She taught them the things she knew. She brought them into the clinic with her and let them watch her work. By the time they were 2, Riven could identify a fever by touching a patient's forehead and saying hot with great authority. By 2.5, Calum was bringing the correct herb from the lower shelf when she named it, picking the right bundle from the dozen hanging there, with a precision that should not have been possible for a child who could not yet read. She taught them to be gentle before she taught them anything else. She taught them to listen to the person speaking before forming a response. She taught them that a person's pain was not something to fix immediately, but something to understand first. These were healer's lessons, but they were also her lessons for them specifically, the things she most wanted them to carry into the kind of life she suspected they would have. Owen came to the cottage one afternoon when the boys were nearly 3 and asked if he could speak with her. He was 82 years old and had been pack elder in Ashvale since before Serafina was born. He had the manner of a man who had long since stopped being careful about saying difficult things, not because he was unkind, but because he had learned that careful words sometimes let dangerous things grow in the dark. "You know what they are," he said. It was not a question. "They are my sons," she said. "Yes," he said, "and I am asking what else." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They are alpha-born. Both of them." He nodded slowly. "I thought so. The shift, the eyes, the way the older one stands when a stranger comes to the door." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I won't be the last to notice. The pack knows something is different. They won't push you, because this is Ashvale, and that is not how we are here, but it will be known eventually." "I know," she said. "Is there a reason," he said carefully, "why their father is not in the picture?" "He chose not to be," she said. "That choice was made before I knew I was pregnant. I did not hide this from him. He simply would not have wanted to know." Owen looked at her over his cup for a long time. He had old wolf eyes, the kind that had seen enough of the world to pick truth out of almost anything. He seemed to find what he was looking for. "All right," he said. "Then they are Ashvale's boys, and that is all they need to be here. But if that ever changes, if the outside world ever decides it has a claim on them, you come to me first, before anyone else. We protect our own." She thanked him. She meant it completely. In the month after Owen's visit, 3 things happened that set the next year in motion. The first was that the Territory News reported an increase in rogue faction activity in the northern borders. The second was that Nora's health began to decline slowly enough that Serafina found herself running the clinic more than assisting in it. The third was that Riven, now 3 years old and furious about being left out of anything, began systematically learning to read, by making Serafina point at every word she used and demanding to know what it said. Calum, watching this process with his characteristic patience, started doing the same thing 2 weeks later, and was reading simple sentences by the end of the month. She enrolled them in the small Ashvale school for the following year. In the meantime, she brought them with her on the forest walks she took to collect plants, and they moved through the trees with a comfort and naturalness that was remarkable in 3-year-olds. Other children their age stumbled on roots and complained about the cold. Riven and Calum moved, as though the forest had been waiting for them. On an evening in late autumn, when the boys were asleep, and the cottage was warm, and the wind was working at the windows, Serafina sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her notebook. She opened it to the first page, which she had not read since she wrote on it 3 years ago. He refused the bond. That is his choice, and it is done. I am going home tomorrow, and I will not think about this again. She read those lines for a long time. Then she turned to a blank page and wrote something new. They are healthy and strong. They are kind. They are curious. They are safe. She underlined that last word once. Safe. That was the word that mattered. Safe was the thing she had built this whole mountain life around, the reason she had taken the bus north and west and north again, the reason she had signed the clinic lease and found Owen and learned every path in the forest around the cottage. Safety was the architecture beneath everything she had made here. She closed the notebook and went to check on the boys before bed, the way she did every night. Riven was sleeping with one arm flung over his head, and his expression set even in sleep. Calum had curled himself into a compact shape with his blanket pulled to his chin, the way he always did, neat and contained. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself simply be present with the reality of them. 2 heartbeats, 2 futures, 2 people who looked to her and found steady ground and did not know yet how much effort that steadiness cost. That was fine. They were 3. They were not supposed to know. She turned off the hallway light and went to bed. Outside, the mountain dark was deep and total, and the forest was quiet, except for the sound of wind in the high branches, and Ashvale slept the sound sleep of a town that did not yet know the world was about to notice it. In the territory capital, 200 miles south, a report crossed a desk in the intelligence division of the King's Council. It mentioned rogue faction movements near the northern borders. It mentioned several small towns along the route. Ashvale was one of 14 names on the list, flagged only because it sat closest to the mountain pass the faction had used in their last 3 raids. No one read it that night. It sat in a stack of similar reports, waiting for morning. That was how it started. Not with a dramatic move or a deliberate choice, but with a name on a list, and a stack of papers, and a morning that had not yet arrived. The report did not stay unread for long. By the following Tuesday, the faction's movements had escalated. They had raided a grain store in a town called Morrow Hollow, 20 miles from the mountain pass. They had disabled the communication towers at a border relay station. 3 pack families had been forced out of their homes near the pass's eastern approach, and the families had arrived in the next nearest town, frightened, and with injuries that the local healer had reported to the Territory Health Office, which had reported it to the council. The council had a name for the faction's leader now, Draven Cole. No relation to Seraphina. Cole was a common enough name. He was a former beta from the 4th Territory who had been stripped of his rank 4 years ago, after a dispute with his alpha that had turned destructive. He had gathered around himself other displaced and angry wolves, the kind who had genuine grievances that had curdled into something worse, and he had given them purpose in the form of a cause she did not fully understand, and the council was still mapping. What the council did not know yet, but Draven did, was that somewhere in the northern mountains, there were 2 unregistered alpha-born children, whose father had never formally claimed them. Draven had paid well for that information, through a network of informants that reached into territory record offices, and he had been looking at the name Ashvale on his own map for 2 weeks before the council's list ever flagged it. Alpha-born children raised outside the official pack structure were rare. Alpha-born twins, both unregistered, with an unknown father, were not simply rare. They were, to someone building a power base, worth more than 100 trained fighters. Wolf society ran on bloodlines and dominance, and alpha blood in a young pup meant an adult who would be formidable, loyal to whoever shaped their early years, and politically valuable in ways that compounded as they grew. Draven was not yet 30, and he was patient in the way that cold-blooded things are patient. He had no interest in rushing. He would come to Ashvale when he was ready. Seraphina did not know about Draven. She knew about the faction in the general way that Ashvale knew, through the territory news and through Owen, who had contacts in the border settlements further south, and shared what he learned at the town's monthly gathering. She knew they were getting closer. She had started sleeping lighter than she used to. She had also, in response to the increasing news, quietly begun asking questions at the clinic. Which families had extended members in other towns? What the evacuation routes out of Ashvale looked like in winter. Whether the pass to the east was navigable if someone needed to move fast with children. Clara, the boarding house daughter who had helped with the births, noticed Seraphina doing this, and one afternoon after the clinic closed, she knocked on the cottage door and said plainly, "You're planning to move again, if things get worse." "I'm gathering information," Seraphina said. "That's not the same as planning." Clara sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, the way she always did, and helped herself to a biscuit from the tin on the counter. "Owen says the faction's last raid was 16 miles from the pass." I know. And the town's guard roster has 12 people, Clara said. Volunteers. Most of them haven't had to actually fight anything in 4 years. I know that too. Clara looked at her. Are you going to run? Serafina thought about this with the same directness she had brought to every decision since the bathroom floor 3 years ago. She thought about the bus rides, the fresh starts, the things she had built in Ashvale from nothing. She thought about Owen saying, "We protect our own." She thought about Riven standing in the doorway of the cottage with his small fists at his sides, growling at a stranger who came too close. She was tired of moving. She was tired of the particular loneliness of being the person who arrives in a new place and starts again. She had arrived in Ashvale because the road was iced over, and she had gotten off the bus to stretch her legs, and what she had found here was real, and it was hers, and she was not ready to leave it. "No," she said. "I'm not going to run." Clara nodded slowly, as though she had expected this answer, and was taking a moment to adjust to it. Then she said, "Then we make a plan." They made one. Over the following 2 weeks, Serafina and Clara, between them, identified the 12 people on the volunteer guard roster, evaluated what they actually knew and could do, and went to Owen with a set of practical proposals. Better communication systems between the outlying cottages and the town center, designated shelter points for families with young children, a rotating watch schedule for the forest edge, a supply of materials that could be used to slow an approach on the main road. Owen approved all of it. He was pleased, she thought, not just with the proposals, but with the fact that she had brought them to him, rather than simply organizing things herself. She understood the importance of that. She was not from Ashvale. It was not her pack to lead. She could contribute knowledge and effort and commitment, but the decisions belonged to the people who had been here for decades. Riven and Calum were told, in age-appropriate terms, that the town was being extra careful right now, and that if Mama said move, they moved, and they did not argue. Riven asked a series of very precise questions about why, and received honest answers, tailored to what a 3-year-old could process. Calum asked one question: where would they go? Serafina said she was working on that. Calum accepted this, and went back to the picture book he was reading. She arranged for the boys to stay with a woman named Peg, who lived in the most central and sheltered house in Ashvale, and had 4 adult children, and a ground floor with no windows facing the road. Peg had been fostering wolf pups in emergency situations for 20 years, and she was steady as stone. Serafina took the boys to visit her twice in the weeks before anything happened, so that the cottage and the familiar smells were already known to them, and so that if she ever had to leave them there quickly in the night, they would not be walking into a stranger's house. She did not tell the boys about Draven. She did not tell them why the town was extra careful. She told them that good people worked together to keep each other safe, and that Ashvale was a place full of good people, and that they were lucky to live here. This was true. She believed it. Calum, who said less but noticed more, looked at her one morning over his porridge with that steady gold gaze and said, "You're worried, Mama." "I'm being careful," she said. "That's different." He considered this. "Is it?" She looked at her 3-year-old and thought about how to answer that. "Sometimes," she said. "Worried is just careful that hasn't figured out what to do yet. I've figured out what to do. So now, I'm just careful." He seemed to find this satisfactory. He went back to his porridge. She went to work. The raid on Ashvale did not start the way she had expected. She had expected the night. She had expected noise on the road, shapes moving in the dark, the thing that woke you from sleep with your heart already ahead of your thoughts. She had drilled herself on what she would do in those first 60 seconds. Shoes, the boys, Peg's house, then back to help where she could. It started in the middle of the afternoon on a gray Thursday in November. And it started not with the faction, but with a man named Garrett, who ran the post office, who came to the clinic at 1 in the afternoon, with a look on his face that Serafina had learned to read over 3 years of treating this town's people. Bad news that had not yet found words. He said that one of the outer farmsteads, the Hale property, had not answered its morning check-in. The watch rotations that Serafina and Clara had helped establish included a check-in system, a signal lamp in the window of each outlying home at dawn. The Hales had not shown their lamp. Garrett had gone out there himself. The farmstead was empty. Not disturbed, not damaged, just empty. The Hales, a couple and their adult son, were not there, and their truck was gone. But so were their dogs and their chickens. which meant they had left by choice and not in a hurry. The Hales had left, without telling anyone, without saying why. Serafina looked at this information from every angle. "Do they have family elsewhere?" she asked. "Cousins in the Second Territory," Garrett said. "Can you reach them there?" "Tried this morning." No answer. She went to find Owen. Owen had not heard yet, and his face went very still when she told him, the way old people's faces go still when they recognize the shape of something bad. He said he would make contact with the 2 other outlying farms and with the border settlement 12 miles south. By 3 o'clock, the picture had come together in a way that made Serafina's chest go cold. The border settlement had evacuated 2 days ago. 2 families from the further outlying farms had also quietly left. People who knew something were leaving, without saying anything to the people who did not know, and that silence was the most dangerous part. It meant the faction was not 12 miles away. It meant the faction was close enough that the people closest to the edge had already decided there was no time left. She went home. She collected the boys from the small neighbor's yard where they had been playing. She told them they were going to stay with Peg for a bit, and that she would be back, and that they needed to take their bags, the small prepared ones that had lived by the door for 3 weeks now. Riven did not argue. He picked up his bag and held Caleb's hand, and they walked with her through the afternoon streets of Ashvale. Clara was already at Peg's house. 3 other families with young children had arrived ahead of them. Peg moved through the controlled chaos of her ground floor, with the same solidity she brought to everything, directing people to rooms, handing out cups, keeping her voice level and her manner unhurried. Serafina crouched down on Peg's front step and held both boys by the hands. "I need you to stay here," she said. "Both of you. I am going to help make sure the town is safe. You listen to Peg and to Clara. If anyone says move, you move immediately. You don't wait. You don't go back for anything. Do you understand?" "Yes," Riven said. His small jaw was set hard. Caleb said, "Come back." Not a question, a requirement. "I am coming back," she said. She walked back to the town center, where Owen and Garrett and several of the guard volunteers had gathered near the square. The temperature was dropping. The sun was low and pale behind a thick layer of cloud. Someone had already lit the perimeter signal fires, the ones they had set up during the planning weeks, small but visible, that told anyone approaching Ashvale in the dark that people here were awake and watching. The faction came at dusk. They came from the east, from the direction of the mountain pass, not the main road, which told Serafina that Draven knew the layout well enough to avoid the obvious approach. She heard them before she saw them, a sound like pressure building, the particular quality of several large bodies moving through the forest in numbers. The town's 12 volunteers were spread across 3 positions. Serafina was not a fighter, she was a healer. She had positioned herself at the community hall, which had been designated as the medical point, along with Nora, whose health was too fragile for anything else, and a young man named Pete, who had basic first aid knowledge. But she could hear what was happening, and what she heard in the first 3 minutes told her the volunteers were not going to be enough. The faction was larger than the intelligence had suggested. The sounds coming from the east were not the sounds of 12 people. She grabbed Pete's arm and told him to stay with Nora, and went to the east edge of the square herself. The first wave of rogues had pushed through the outer signal fires and was moving up the main forest path. She could see them now in the dropping light, fast-moving shapes, some shifted and some not. The volunteers at the east position were holding but barely, and 2 of them were already pulling back toward the center of town. She heard Garrett shouting. She heard someone crash through the fence beside the hardware store. She turned back toward the community hall to check how much time she had to move Nora and Pete to a safer position before the center of town was reached. She ran directly into a man coming the other way around the corner of the hall. He caught her before she fell. His hands on her arms were steady and hard, and immediately released her once she had her footing. She looked up. She had seen those eyes once before, in a gold-lit hall 200 miles south of here, 3 years ago. The world went very quiet. Kalen Voss said, "Which direction?" It took her a full 2 seconds to understand what was happening. He was here. He was in Ashvale. He was standing in front of her in the near dark, with his jaw set and his eyes going between her face and the east edge of the square in rapid assessment, and he was asking her a tactical question, as though there were not 3 years of history sitting between them. She pointed east. 12 or more, some shifted. Volunteers are holding, but pulling back. He had a communicator in his hand. He said something into it, short and clipped, and she heard the response crackle back. Then he moved past her toward the east position. Behind him came 6 people. 4 of them were large enough and moved in the particular way that said trained enforcement, and the other 2 had the look of scouts. They spread out as they moved, taking positions without being told, covering the angles on instinct. Serafina stood at the corner of the hall for exactly 3 seconds. Then she made a decision. She went to the community hall. She checked on Nora and Pete. She organized the medical space with everything she had been preparing for weeks: clean cloths, the herb compounds she had already measured into doses, the bone-setting tools, the water supply she had stored in jugs along the east wall. She did this quickly and without panic. Then she waited. The fighting lasted 40 minutes, which was shorter than she had feared, and longer than she could stand. She heard it more than saw it, sounds of impact and shouting, and the deeper sounds of wolves who had shifted, and twice the unmistakable crash of someone going through the wooden fence that ran along the east side of the square. The first injured person to reach the hall was one of Ashvale's own volunteers, a young woman named Bree, who had taken a blow to the shoulder that had dislocated it. Serafina said it, while Bree pressed her teeth together and did not make a sound. The second was a stranger, one of Kalen's enforcement team, a big man with a cut across his forearm that looked worse than it was. She closed it with the pressure compound she had developed over 3 years of clinic work, and was told by the man, through tight-lipped gratitude, that it was the most effective thing he had ever had put on a wound. The third was Garrett, who had a broken finger and a stunned look. She splinted the finger, and he sat on the bench near the door for the rest of the time, watching the square through the window. When it stopped fast. The sounds cut off, and were replaced by the particular silence of things that have ended. She heard voices, including Kalen's, low and directive. She heard movement, systematic, organized, the sound of his team working through a situation being brought under control. Owen came to the hall doorway. He looked tired but unhurt. He said, "We have 3 injuries on our side, all minor. None of Ashvale's people are seriously hurt. The faction has been pushed back, and their advance group captured." He paused. The King's enforcement arrived about 40 minutes before they did. "Someone sent warning." "Someone sent his team?" she said. "He came himself," Owen said. He looked at her with those old eyes. "He came himself, Serafina." She processed that. "The boys," she said. "Safe." I checked. She stood up from the bench where she had been sitting while she spoke to Owen, and she felt the adrenaline leaving her body in a long, slow wave, the kind that left you hollow and steadier at the same time. She had been in controlled motion for 3 hours. Now she was still, and the stillness had weight. Kalen was in the square with his team, and Owen, and the volunteer guards. She could see him through the hall's window, a large, still figure in the dark, giving instructions with the economy of someone accustomed to not needing to repeat himself. He had come himself. She did not know yet what that meant. She did not know what had brought him here, what he had been told, what he knew or did not know about the 2 small boys currently staying at Peg's house in the center of town. She knew he was here. She knew there was no road back from that, no clean separation between the life she had built and the person standing in the square 30 feet away from her. She put the remaining medical supplies in order. She covered Nora with an extra blanket. She told Pete he had done well and meant it. Then she stood at the hall doorway and waited. He would come to her, or she would go to him, and either way the next conversation was coming, and she had approximately 60 seconds to decide how she was going to hold herself when it arrived. She chose the way she had always chosen to hold herself in difficult moments, directly, with her spine straight and her hands easy at her sides, and her face showing only what she intended to show. Whatever came next, it would find her exactly as she was. She had made sure of that a long time ago. He came to her. She had not moved from the doorway of the hall when he crossed the square. The rest of his team was still managing the perimeter and dealing with the captured faction members, and Owen had gone to supervise the volunteers, and the square was briefly quiet in the particular way that places are quiet after something has been resolved but not finished. Kalen walked to her with that same unhurried gait she had seen once in a gold-lit hall, and he stopped in the space of the doorway, and the light from inside the hall fell across his face. He looked different from 3 years ago. There were more lines around his eyes. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been working very hard at something and not sleeping well enough. She looked at him, with the same steady attention she gave to patients who walked into the clinic with something complicated. She noticed everything she noticed, and she did not react to any of it. "You're not hurt," he said. Not a question. "No," she said. "My townspeople are all right. Minor injuries. Your team?" "One with a cut that's been seen to. My medic says your work." It was manageable. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear something happening behind his eyes, some decision being worked through, and she waited to see which way it would land. "I received intelligence 3 days ago," he said, "that a faction led by Draven was targeting Ashvale specifically. The report mentioned you by name." She kept her face level. Why would his intel mention me? Kalen looked at her directly, because the same report that named Ashvale also described 2 Alpha-born children living there, unregistered, with an unknown father. She did not move. She had known this was coming. She had known it would come eventually, and she had not been able to stop it, and she had made peace with that, or she had thought she had. Standing here in the hall doorway with it actually arriving was different from making peace with the abstract possibility of it. "My sons," she said, "are safe, and that is what matters right now." "I know," he said quietly. Something in his voice was different from what she had expected. She had been ready for authority. She had been ready for a command, a claim, the kind of language that the Alpha King used when he had decided something was his. She had not been ready for the particular quiet of a man who was trying very carefully not to take up too much space. "I'm not here to make demands," he said. "I need you to know that before anything else. I came because there was a threat to this town, and you were in it. And that was the only thing I was focused on for the past 3 days. She looked at him. "You should know," she said, "that whatever you came here for, it has nothing to do with any claim or entitlement. You made a decision 3 years ago. You sent Corbin with a form. Whatever is here in Ashvale exists because I built it, and any question of access or involvement will be decided by me, on my terms, in my time." "I understand," he said. She had been ready to say more. She had been ready to say a great deal more, and she had the words lined up in the order she had always known she would eventually need them. And he had said, "I understand," and it had not sounded like a negotiating position. It had sounded like a man who meant it. She was suspicious of that. She was suspicious of it in the specific, experienced way that someone who has been disappointed before learns to be suspicious of things that come too easily. But she was also too tired, and too full of the last 3 hours, to have a larger conversation tonight. "Where are you staying?" she asked. He looked faintly surprised that this was the question. "My team will set up at the edge of town. I wasn't planning to intrude." "Good," she said. "Then we'll talk tomorrow. In the daylight, when I've slept and the town has had a chance to settle." He nodded. She went to get her boys. Peg's house was warm and bright and full of families who had sheltered there during the hours of tension. Riven and Calum were on the floor in the main room with 2 other children, building something out of wooden blocks with the focused energy of children who had been sitting still for a very long time and were working it out through construction. They looked up when she came in. Riven scrambled upright. Calum set down his block carefully first, then stood. She crouched and held them both, one arm around each, and for a long moment she simply existed in the fact of them being here, and unhurt, and real. Riven was talking. A rapid update about what had happened, and what Peg had said, and what they had eaten for dinner, and the question of whether the noise outside had been the bad people, all running together in the way his words always ran, when he had been holding them in for a while. Calum just held on. "Are you okay?" Calum said, into her shoulder. "I'm okay," she said. "Are you?" He leaned back and looked at her with those gold eyes. 3 years old, and he was checking her face, the way she had taught him to check a patient's face, looking for the real answer under the surface one. Whatever he found, he seemed satisfied with. He nodded and went back to his block tower. Serafina carried them home through the now quiet streets of Ashvale. They were heavy and warm and almost asleep by the time she reached the cottage. She settled them into their beds, pulled the blankets up, checked every window and the door lock, and then sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. Kalen Voss was camped at the edge of her town. He had come himself, 3 days after receiving the intelligence, which meant he had moved fast. He had brought an effective team. He had deployed them correctly. He had arrived in time. She was not grateful. She was not angry. She was in the place between those two things where the facts simply were what they were, and had not yet settled into a feeling she could name. She made tea she did not drink. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the mountain forest outside the window, the wind in the high trees, the occasional crack of a branch in the cold, the distant sound of water. These were the sounds she had gone to sleep to for 3 years, and they had always been enough to settle her. Tonight they were enough. Just barely. Tomorrow would be what it would be, and she would meet it as she had always met things, directly, with her eyes open and her hands steady, and a very clear idea of who she was and what she would and would not allow. She was Serafina Cole. She had built a life from nothing in a mountain town. She had raised 2 extraordinary children alone. She had organized a defense plan for a community that was not her original pack. She had treated injuries while the sounds of a fight came through the walls. She was not afraid of tomorrow, but she was tired, and she had earned that, and so she closed her eyes and let the tiredness do what it was for. She woke before the boys, which was unusual. Normally Riven was awake before the sun, and announcing it loudly. Today she came to consciousness slowly, aware first of the cold in the room, and then of the particular weight of everything that had happened yesterday, which settled back onto her in the way that difficult things always settle back after a night of sleep, heavier than the night before because rest has had time to let it become real. She dressed and started the fire in the kitchen stove before the light came fully. She put the porridge on. She stood at the kitchen window with a cup of hot water and looked out at the cottage garden, which was brown and frost-edged at this time of year, and thought about what she would say when she sat down with Kaylin this morning. She had been turning this over in her mind for the better part of 3 years, without knowing she would ever need to actually do it. She had thought about it the way you think about a fire drill, not really believing it will become necessary, going through the motions as preparation rather than expectation. Now it was necessary, and she had all the preparation and none of the certainty that preparation was supposed to give you. There were things she needed to say to him that had nothing to do with the boys. There were things that she had carried for 3 years and that deserved to be said plainly, not to change anything, and not because she wanted something from him, but because they were true, and they had sat in her long enough. She would say them. She would do that first, before any conversation about Riven and Calum, because the conversation about Riven and Calum needed her to be standing on clear ground. Riven appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:30, with his hair standing up, and his eyes still half closed, and his expression already focused. He was, even at 3 years old, a person who came to consciousness fully formed. He woke, and he was present. Calum appeared 2 minutes later, with the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, dragging it across the kitchen floor, and climbed onto his chair, and put his head down on the table, and went back to looking asleep. She made them porridge, and cut the last of the apples she had in the cold store, and put it in 2 bowls, and they ate while she stood at the window, watching the light come up over the tree line. "A man came last night," Riven said. She turned. He was eating his porridge and not looking at her, and his voice had the elaborate casualness of a child who has been thinking about something for a while. "A tall man," he added. "Peg's window faces the square, and I saw." She sat down at the table across from him. Calum had lifted his head and was now watching her with full attention from beneath his blanket. "Yes," she said. "A man came with his team to help keep the town safe." "Who is he?" Riven asked. This was the question, of course. It always came down to this question, and she had been ready for it since before they could ask it. She had thought about what she would say, and had changed her answer 4 times over 3 years, and had settled on a version of the truth that was shaped for 3-year-olds, and was not a lie. "He is someone I knew a long time ago," she said, "before you were born." Riven absorbed this. "Is he a good person?" "I don't know him well enough to answer that," she said. "I am going to find out. That's why we're going to talk today." Calum said from under his blanket, "Does he know about us?" Serafina looked at her smaller son. Sometimes his directness stopped her completely. "He will," she said, "after we talk." Calum nodded. He pulled the blanket tighter and went back to his porridge. She arranged for the boys to spend the morning with Clara, who had spent the night at Peg's and was in the square at 8 o'clock, with the kind of brisk, competent energy she always had after a difficult night. Clara asked no questions, took the boys by the hands, and walked them toward the bakery, which was one of the few businesses already open, and was serving hot rolls to half the town, as a kind of collective exhale after yesterday. Serafina walked to the eastern edge of town, where Kalen's team had made camp in the cleared area behind the old grain store. The team was awake and active, two of them reviewing something on a tablet, one making adjustments to a piece of equipment she did not recognize, and the fourth standing at the camp's edge with a cup and watching her approach. None of them moved to intercept her. They had the manner of professionals who understood that certain situations were not theirs to manage. Kalen was sitting on a folding chair near a small fire, holding a cup, looking toward the forest. He stood when he heard her approach. She noticed he did not come toward her. He waited. That was something. She stopped a few feet from him. The morning was cold and bright, the sun finally clear after yesterday's clouds, and the snow-topped mountains above the tree line were sharp and white against the blue sky. She looked at him in full daylight, and he was exactly what she had remembered, and also different, older, and more tired, and more careful. "I want to say something before we talk about anything else," she said. "All right," he said. She had organized this the way she organized a difficult conversation at the clinic, with the most important thing first, and the supporting details after. "3 years ago," she said, "you felt the mate bond in that hall as clearly as I did. You made a choice in about 60 seconds, and sent your advisor to deliver it the next morning, with a form for me to sign. I don't know what drove that choice. I don't know if it was fear or political calculation, or something else entirely. And at this point, it does not matter. What matters is that the choice was made, and I lived in the space it created, and what I built in that space is mine. My children are mine. This town, the work I do here, the life I have made, all of it is mine. No decision you make going forward changes that ownership. Are we clear?" "Yes," he said. "I am not angry at you," she said, which surprised her slightly, even as she said it, because she had thought she might be, and she was finding she was not anymore. "I was hurt. I was frightened. And then I was practical. I have been practical for 3 years, and I am good at it. But I am not going to pretend that what happened did not happen, or that it did not cost me something real." "I know," he said, and then, before she could continue, he said, "I was wrong. I want to be clear about that myself, before anything else. What I did was wrong. The decree, the advisor, the form. The way I handled it was wrong. I don't have a good reason for it that holds up. I have reasons, but they don't hold up." She looked at him for a long moment. She was assessing this the way she assessed everything, looking for the structure underneath the words, checking whether it was genuine or managed. She found something she had not expected. She found that he was embarrassed, not performatively. The real, quiet embarrassment of a person who has had 3 years to sit with a decision that they know was not their best one. "Why did you come yourself?" she asked. "You have enforcers. You could have sent Dax, or whoever manages your northern operations." "I know. So why did you come?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because it was you. And because I had already done the thing where I let someone else carry my decisions for me, and I was not going to do it again." She absorbed this. "There are children," she said, "my children. They are 3 years old. They are extraordinary, and they are mine. And before they are anything else, they are people, not political assets, and not tools, and not prizes. If you have any idea of using them in any way that puts your council's agenda before their well-being, I need to know that now, so we can end this conversation where it is." "I don't," he said. The steadiness in his voice was genuine. She had treated enough patience to know when someone was working to project calm they did not have, and this was not that. "I don't have an agenda. I came here because they were in danger, and because I had information that could prevent something bad happening to them. That is the only reason." She breathed through this. "When can I meet them?" he asked, and then immediately, "When you decide it's appropriate." "Not before." She looked at the mountains above the tree line for a moment. She thought about Caleb asking, "Does he know about us?" with the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. She thought about Riven, watching through Peg's window at a tall man in the square. "Tonight," she said. "At the cottage, dinner." Whatever he had been expecting, that was not it. She saw the small shift in his expression, surprise quickly organized into something more careful. He nodded. "I'll be there," he said. She walked back to the center of town. She was halfway across the square when it occurred to her that she had just invited the Alpha King to dinner in her small cottage in a mountain town. and that the kitchen currently contained half a turnip and some dried lentils, and that if this evening was going to have any kind of dignity, she needed to go to the market. She went to the market. She bought what she needed. She picked up the boys from the bakery, where Riven had eaten 2.5 rolls, and Calum had very quietly eaten 3, and told no one. She cooked all afternoon. It was something to do with her hands while her mind worked through everything ahead. The boys helped, or assisted in the particular way that 3-year-olds assist with cooking, which involved a great deal of tasting and commentary, and occasionally putting things back in the wrong container. She did not tell them who was coming to dinner. She told them she was having a guest, and that it was someone she wanted them to meet properly, and that she expected them to use their manners, because they always used their manners, even when company made it harder. Riven said, "Is it the tall man from the square?" "Yes," she said. Calum said nothing. He stirred the lentils he had been assigned to stir, and did not look up, and she watched his small face work through something she could not quite read. Then he said, "Does he know who we are?" She set down the spoon she was holding. "Not yet," she said. "He will tonight." Calum looked up. His gold eyes were level and clear. "Okay," he said, and went back to stirring. She finished making dinner. The evening came in fast, the way mountain evenings do in November, the light dropping off the mountains and the temperature falling quickly behind it. She lit the lamps. She set the table with 4 places, the first time she had done that, and looked at it for a moment before she moved the extra chair to the right position. At 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the cottage door. She dried her hands on the dishcloth. She straightened her shirt. She went to the door. She opened it. He was standing on the step with his hands easy at his sides, and nothing in his expression that was performing anything. No authority, and no performance, and no careful management. He just looked like a man standing on a step, uncertain of his welcome, hoping for something he did not yet know the name of. She stepped back. "Come in," she said. He came in. The cottage was warm, and smelled of lentil soup and bread, and the dried herbs hanging from the kitchen ceiling. It was a small space, and he was a large person, and the first thing she noticed was how careful he was about it, angling slightly so that his coat did not sweep the shelf near the door, taking up less room than he actually occupied. Riven was in the kitchen doorway immediately. That was Riven. Always first, always positioned to intercept anything new before it reached the rest of the household. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his chin up, and he looked at Kaelin, with the focused assessment of a child, who had been doing this since before he could walk. Kaelin looked back. Serafina watched both of them. She watched the moment land on Kaelin's face. Not recognition, exactly. Something prior to recognition. Something that moved through his expression like a wave moves under the surface of still water, changing the shape of everything without breaking it. Riven said, "You're bigger in the house." "I know," Kaelin said. "Sorry about that." "Do you have to be?" "Not always," Kaelin said. "It's easier outside." Riven considered this with great seriousness. Then he stepped back into the kitchen, which was apparently his version of an acceptance. Calum was at the table, not in the doorway. He had stayed at the table, and he was watching from there, which was always how Calum worked, getting the full picture before he moved into it. She took Kaelin's coat and hung it by the door. "Dinner is ready," she said. "We'll eat." They sat down together at the small kitchen table. The 4 of them, in the warm lamplit kitchen, with the mountain dark outside the window, and the soup in the center, and the bread on the board. It was so thoroughly ordinary that she had to take a breath. She watched Kaelin at the table. He did not take up the space in the way she had half expected. He did not direct anything. He poured soup into his bowl when the boys had been served, not before. When Riven asked him a question about whether he had ever been to the mountains before, he answered it directly, and without condescension, the way adults rarely spoke to small children, as though the question were as reasonable as any other question, because it was. Riven asked approximately 40 questions over the course of dinner. What is your job? Where do you sleep when you camp outside? Do you know how to make fire without matches? Have you ever seen a bear? What is your favorite food? Do you like soup? Kaelin answered all 40. Some answers were short and some longer, and he asked questions back, and Riven answered those with the same energetic precision he brought to everything. Calum ate his soup. He listened. He did not ask anything. When the bowls were empty, Serafina cleared the table and brought the bread, And while she was at the counter, Calum said, in his quiet, considered way, "My mother knew you before we were born." Calum looked at him. "That's right," he said. "Where?" "A gathering, far away from here." "Did you know each other well?" Calum was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Not well enough. That was my mistake." Calum processed this with the long, unhurried attention he gave to everything. He picked up a piece of bread. He looked at Calum with those gold eyes, steady and clear, and said, "Do you want to know us better?" The room went very still. Even Riven had stopped talking. Calum looked at Calum, this 3-year-old who had managed in 9 words to ask the most important question of the evening, and something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. "Yes," Calum said. He said it simply, without armor. "If you'll let me." Calum nodded, once, the way Owen nodded when he had made a decision. Then he ate his bread. Riven immediately started asking questions again, louder now, as though the quiet had backed up behind a door that was now open. Calum answered them. Serafina sat at the table and drank her tea, and watched her sons with this man who had not known them 1 day ago, and did not try to decide what she felt about it yet. She let it exist without naming it. After dinner, the boys were put to bed. They went without too much protest, which she took as a sign that the evening had been enough, but not too much. She tucked them in. Riven first, Calum second. Calum held onto her hand for a moment, before she turned off the light.
"Is he staying?"
he asked. "Tonight, with his team," she said. "After that, I don't know yet." He seemed to find this acceptable. He let go of her hand. She came back to the kitchen, and found Calum at the window, looking out into the dark. He turned when she came in. She sat at the table and he sat across from her, and the lamp was low, and the fire in the stove was burning down, and the two of them looked at each other across the small kitchen table. "They are remarkable," he said. "I know," she said. "You did that," he said. Not a compliment exactly, more like recognizing a fact. "I did most of it. This town helped. Nora and Owen and Clara and Peg." She paused. "They belong to this place as much as they belong to me." He nodded. She said, "What happens now, from your side?" "I need to understand what you are thinking, practically." He was honest about it. His counsel would need to know. There were formal registration processes for Alpha-born children, processes she had been aware of, and had been holding off by filing the birth certificates as she had, with father unknown. Those would need to be addressed. He could manage the process in a way that kept the boy's situation private from the wider territories until she was ready for it not to be. But that required her cooperation with the registration, and it required at minimum that his counsel knew what they were, even if the general public did not. She had expected this. She had known it was coming since the morning she had gotten back on the bus north. "What do you want?" she asked. "For yourself, not for the council." He looked at her, and for once she could read his face fully, because whatever he had put on it in public or in those territories had not come with him to this mountain kitchen. "I want to know them," he said. "I want to be worth knowing. To them, I don't expect anything from you that you're not willing to give, and I'm not going to pretend 3 years of absence can be walked back in an evening, but if you'll give me the chance to be present, I'll take it." She looked at him for a long time. "You'll have to earn it," she said. "Every part of it. There is nothing automatic here. No claim, no title, no bond gives you anything in this cottage that you haven't earned." "I know," he said. "And your council, and your court, and the politics of 7 territories do not come through my door, unless I say so." "Agreed." She looked at the table. She looked at the lamp. She looked at him. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "We'll see." He stood. He thanked her for dinner, and he meant it. She gave him his coat. He went out into the cold mountain night without asking for anything more. She stood at the closed door for a long time. Outside, the forest was dark, and the mountains were dark, and the town was quiet, and somewhere at the edge of it, Kalen Voss was walking back to a camp where his team would be waiting, and the world was different from what it had been yesterday, and there was no clean way back to anything, and she was not sure anymore that she wanted one. She checked on the boys. They were asleep, Riven with his arm flung out and Calum curled neatly. She turned off the lamp and went to bed. She stared at the dark ceiling for a long time. The mountain wind moved through the trees outside, and the cottage walls were solid around her, and she had built all of this herself, and she was not going to forget that. Whatever came next, it would be on her terms. She had been sure of that since she was 21 on a bathroom floor, and she was sure of it now, and the certainty felt good, the way solid ground feels good under your feet after a long time on ice. She slept. He came back the next morning with a bag of groceries. She was at the clinic when Clara knocked on the examining room door and said, very carefully, as though reporting something that required careful handling, "There is a very large man at the front desk who would like to know if the market near the square carries good coffee, and he is holding a bag that appears to already contain it." Serafina set down the reference text she had been reading. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would ask," Clara said. "I was not entirely sure what the correct protocol was." "There is no protocol," Serafina said. "Tell him I'll be free in an hour." Clara relayed this. The large man, apparently, said he would wait, and was there a chair he could sit on that was out of the way? There was. He sat in it for an hour, without bothering anyone, which she found out afterward because several patients mentioned him, always in the same tone of carefully neutral interest that said they had recognized him, and were performing the very Ashvale thing of pretending that recognizing the Alpha King was perfectly ordinary. She found him in the waiting area when she came out, still in the chair, reading a leaflet about winter nutrition that Nora had written 6 years ago. He stood when she came in and held out the bag. "I don't know how you take it," he said, "so I got plain beans, and the grinder is in there, and I thought you might prefer to make it yourself." She looked at the bag. She looked at him. There was something about the gesture, specific and practical, and leaving the control with her, that she could not quite decide about. She took the bag. "I have 15 minutes, she said. "Come in." They sat in the clinic's small back room, where Nora used to take her afternoon tea, and Serafina made coffee while Kaylin sat on the other stool, and did not attempt to help, or direct, or take up more space than he needed. She set a cup in front of him, and sat down with her own. "Corbin has been in contact," he said. "From your counsel?" "Yes. He knows I'm here. He's inferring more than he's been told, which is Corbin's primary skill." A pause. "He wants a formal report. When do you need to give it?" "I can manage the timeline," he said. "Within a week, probably. I wanted you to know before it happened." She drank her coffee. She thought about the word manage. She thought about what it meant, that he was telling her before doing it, rather than doing it, and then telling her. "What will you tell him?" she asked. "That there are 2 Alpha-born children in Ashvale, currently registered with Father Unknown, who are the biological children of the Alpha King, and a woman named Serafina Cole, and that I intend to pursue a relationship with both my children and their mother that is appropriate and respectful, and managed entirely at the pace she determines." She had not expected that last part. She set down her cup. "You're including the last part in a formal report to your council?" "Yes. They'll want to know what that means." "I'll tell them it means what it says," he said. "I'm clear with my counsel that the decisions here are not theirs to make." She thought about this. She thought about Corbin, with his flat professional voice, and his gray suit, and the form he had held out to her 3 years ago. She thought about what it would mean for Kaylin to go back to that council with this statement. "They won't like it," she said. "No," he agreed. "That bothers me less than you might expect," she said, and meant it entirely. Something close to warmth moved through his expression. Not a smile exactly. More like the face you make when something lands exactly right. She had an afternoon of patience to get back to. She told him so. He finished his coffee, thanked her for it, and left. Clara was at the front desk when he passed through, and said a polite goodbye, and Clara said a polite goodbye back, and the door closed. Clara came to the back room 30 seconds later, with an expression that contained a great many questions she was being disciplined about not asking. "He brought his own coffee grinder," Serafina said, preemptively. Clara nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "I'll go back to the files." She went back to the files. The week that followed was not what Serafina had expected. She had expected Kaylin to be present in a large and managing way, the way powerful people tend to be present, filling space and directing things, and needing to be the organizing principle of any room they were in. She had braced for it. She had prepared her responses. He was not like that here. He helped Garrett and 2 of the volunteers rebuild the section of fence the faction had broken, which involved no authority and considerable manual labor. He spent 2 mornings at the grain store, helping Owen catalog the damage assessment from the raid. He was quiet in the way of someone accustomed to giving orders who had decided, for this specific time and place, to do neither. He came to the cottage every evening. Serafina had not told him to come, and she had not told him not to. He came at the same time each evening and knocked and waited, and she let him in, and they had dinner. And after dinner the boys were awake for another hour. The hour after dinner was where things shifted. Riven had decided, in the comprehensive way that Riven decided things, that Kalen was interesting. He wanted to know everything, and he wanted to know it immediately. What was the capital of the Third Territory? How many people were in the Alpha King's Council? What did enforcers actually do? Where was the king's seat located, and was it big? Was the forest around it good or bad for walking? Kalen answered everything, without shortening the truth. He described the council with the same directness he would have used with a peer. He described the territories in detail, their landscapes and their populations and their difficulties. Riven absorbed it all with the focused hunger of someone encountering a map of a world he had not known existed. Caleb did not ask questions in the evenings. He was present in the way he was always present, quiet and attentive, sitting near Serafina while Riven conducted his extended interviews across the kitchen table. But on the 3rd evening, while Riven had gone to find a book to show Caleb said, without looking up from the block he was building with, "You made my mother sad." Caleb went very still. "A long time ago," Caleb said. "She doesn't talk about it, but it was you." "Yes," Caleb said. "It was." Caleb placed a block on his structure with careful precision. "Why?" Serafina had stopped moving at the counter. She did not intervene. She waited. "I was afraid," Caleb said. "I made a choice that was based on fear, and I dressed it up to look like something more reasonable, and it wasn't." Caleb looked at him then, directly, without flinching. "Are you still afraid?" he asked. A long pause. "Of getting this wrong," Caleb said. "Yes." Caleb considered this for a moment. Then he went back to his blocks. The conversation was apparently complete on his end. Riven came back with the book, and the evening continued, and Serafina finished what she was doing at the counter and brought tea to the table. And if Caleb looked somewhat altered by the conversation with her 3-year-old, he was professional enough not to say so. On the 5th evening, after the boys were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, Caleb said, "I owe you an explanation, not because it changes what happened, but because you deserve to know what the actual reason was." She sat down. "Go ahead." "My council," he said, "had been managing my mate prospects for 2 years before that gathering. There were 3 females in the territories who they had identified as politically appropriate, and I had been told, very clearly, and with the full weight of my council behind it, that my choice would affect alliances that had taken years to build. When the bond hit, the first thought I had, the very first one, was that they were going to say, 'She is from a border pack of 43 people, and we cannot use this.'" He stopped. He looked at the table. "I let my next thought be theirs," he said. "I didn't think it through. I let 30 seconds of panic turn into Corbin, with a form the next morning, and I have not stopped thinking about those 30 seconds for 3 years." She sat with this. "You could have spoken to me," she said, "that morning. You could have come yourself instead of sending Corbin. I know. I would not have argued. I would not have made it difficult, but you could have come. I know that too," he said. She was quiet for a while. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the trees. The fire in the stove ticked softly. "I believe you," she said finally. "I'm not saying it fixes it, but I believe that's what happened." He nodded. She stood and took the cups to the basin. She washed them in the way she washed things when she needed a moment, methodically, one at a time, letting the warm water do its organizing work. When she turned around, he was standing by the door with his coat, not having moved toward it to perform leaving, simply present and waiting. "Come earlier tomorrow," she said. "I want you to see the forest path the boys use. Caleb found something in the roots of the big oak at the South Bend that he's been checking on every day for 2 weeks, and I think it's something alive." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'll come at 4, he said. "Good," she said. She opened the door. He went out into the cold. She watched him go down the path toward the edge of town where his team was camped, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, in the cold mountain air, with her arms crossed against it. She was not forgiving him yet. She was not anywhere close to done with what needed to be done before anything like that could happen. But she was also not standing behind a wall she had no intention of moving from. She went inside. She checked on the boys. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and let the day settle, and she was still, and the mountain was still, and the forest was still, and something in her was just slightly less braced than it had been the day before. She noticed that. She did not decide yet what to do with it. Tomorrow she would take him to the oak tree and let Calum show him the thing in the roots and watch to see how he was with that, with the patience it required and the wonder it deserved. That would tell her something. She was paying close attention to everything that told her something. The thing in the oak roots was a hedgehog. It had apparently decided that the hollow between the two largest roots of the South Bend oak was an acceptable place to spend the winter, and Calum had discovered it 2 weeks ago while walking the path with Seraphina, and had checked on it every day since with the systematic dedication he brought to all of his serious interests. He had given it a name, which was Grove, and he had researched hedgehogs in the best way available to a 3-year-old who could not yet fully read, which was asking Seraphina questions about them until she produced the relevant pages from the nature guide on the kitchen shelf. He brought Calum to it at 4 o'clock on the following afternoon, walking slightly ahead on the path, and occasionally glancing back to ensure he was being followed, with the particular manner of someone leading an expedition. Riven walked beside Calum and talked continuously. When they reached the oak, Calum stopped and crouched at the roots with the slow, controlled movements she had taught him, the approach a healer uses when something small and easily startled is nearby. He peered into the hollow and then looked back at Calum and gestured for him to come closer. Calum crouched. Seraphina stood back and watched. He crouched on the forest path beside her 3-year-old son and looked into the dark of the root hollow, where Grove was apparently visible as a small spiny shape, and he stayed there for a long time looking at it, and Calum said in his lowest voice that Grove came out at dusk sometimes and ate things but mostly right now was sleeping, and Calum said that hedgehogs needed to sleep a lot in the cold, and Calum said he knew that, and Calum said of course he did. And then they stayed there together, in the quiet of the South Bend oak for several more minutes, while Riven crouched on Calum's other side, and also watched the hedgehog, and managed to be quieter than usual, which was something she had never fully achieved with the hedgehog in all 2 weeks. She stood back among the trees, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Something that was not about the past and not about the future, and was entirely about this specific afternoon in November, with the cold light in the branches, and the sound of the forest and her sons, crouched beside a man who was crouched beside an oak root, looking at a sleeping hedgehog with absolute genuine attention. She was not ready to name it. She was not going to name it today, but she felt it. They walked back to the cottage in the dropping light, Riven talking about hedgehog biology, with the confident inaccuracy of someone who has recently learned several facts and is not yet sure of their exact edges. Calum, walking with his hands in his pockets, and occasionally correcting his brother on the finer points. Calum walked between them and contributed when he had something accurate to add, and stayed quiet when he did not. At the cottage, she made soup, and Calum sat at the kitchen table and helped Riven work through the picture in the nature guide that showed the hedgehog in its winter state. And Calum sat beside Seraphina at the counter while she chopped and said, very quietly, so only she could hear, "I think he's okay." She kept chopping. "Good," she said. "He crouched for a long time," Calum said. "He didn't look like he was waiting to get up." She understood what that meant. Calum noticed when adults performed interest in children's things versus having it. He noticed the difference between someone who crouched and counted the seconds until they could stand again, and someone who crouched because they were actually interested. "He was actually looking," she said. "Yes," Calum agreed, and went to sit at the table. After dinner, after the boys were in bed, Calum stayed to help clear up. She did not ask him to, and he did not ask if he could. He simply collected the bowls and brought them to the basin, the way you do when you know where things go and it is not a complicated decision. She washed and he dried, and they worked in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had expected the silence to be full of things that needed to be said. She had been holding so many things for so long that she had expected every quiet moment with him to feel loaded. This one did not. It felt like a kitchen being cleaned by two people who were both tired and both present. When it was done, she hung the dishcloth and he put the last bowl away, and she turned and leaned against the counter and looked at him. "Corbin called you today," she said. It was not a question. She had heard the communicator sound twice in the late afternoon when he was on the forest path, and he had stepped away from the boys to answer it briefly. "Yes." "What did you tell him?" "What I said I would tell him," Kalen said. He was not pleased. "I'd imagine not." He raised the question of formal registration. He raised it 3 times. "What did you say?" "That it would happen on a timeline determined by the children's mother, and that this was not a point of negotiation." She looked at him. She thought about all the times in the past 3 years when she had imagined this scenario, and had imagined it going differently than this. She had imagined pressure and legal language, and the machinery of 7 territories moving toward her with the weight of a tide. She had been preparing for that. "Corbin is going to keep pushing," she said. "He will." "And your other council members?" "Yes. And at some point it will come from more than one direction." "Probably," he said. "I want you to understand," she said, "that I am not afraid of that. I have been living in anticipation of it for 3 years, and I have the documentation, and the witnesses, and Owen in my corner, and if someone wants to try to tell me what I am required to do regarding my own children, I will go to the wall on it. I'm saying this," she continued, "so you understand that I don't need you as protection. If you are present in this situation, you are present because it is the right thing for Riven and Calum, not because I need a buffer between myself and your council." "Understood," he said. "Good." She straightened from the counter. "Then we're clear." He nodded. He took his coat from by the door. He looked at her one more time, with that expression that had been slowly becoming less careful over the evenings, the one that was not yet fully open, but was no longer fully managed. "Good night, Serafina," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Cole, not the careful formal distance of a stranger, her name. "Good night," she said. She closed the door after him. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment, feeling the cold from outside seeping through the wood. Then she went to check on the boys, and she stood in the doorway of their room, listening to the sound of them breathing in the warm dark, and she thought about what Calum had said. He was okay. He crouched for a long time. She was not going to let those small things mean too much. She was watching for patterns, not moments, but she was watching. She went to bed and slept deeply, and woke in the morning to Riven, announcing from the hallway that he had dreamed about hedgehogs, and it had been a very good dream, and could he see Grove again today, and she said yes, if the path was clear of ice. And he said it was because he had already looked out the window, and the ice was only on the north side, and the south path was clear. And she lay in her bed for a moment in the early light, and let herself have the small, uncomplicated pleasure of that. Just for a moment. Then she got up. Corbin arrived in Ashvale on the 9th day. She had known he was coming. Kaelin had told her 3 days before, without apology and without managing it, simply, "Corbin has requested to come, and I have told him the conditions. He will be here Tuesday. If you want him to leave immediately, I will send him back." She had said, "Let him come, I want to meet him on my ground this time." He arrived in a sleek territory vehicle that looked very out of place on Ashvale's main street, where the vehicles were old trucks and practical 4-wheel drives, and occasionally a rusted thing that Garrett kept promising to have looked at. Corbin got out in his gray suit and looked at the mountains, and then looked at the main street, with the expression of a man who found the situation tolerable but would not have chosen it. He was shorter than she remembered. That happened sometimes with people who had delivered large news. They stayed large in memory and were smaller in person. She was at the clinic when he came in. Clara showed him to the back room without comment. He sat in the same chair Kaelin had sat in on the first morning. "Miss Cole," he said. "Hello, Corbin," she said. She used his first name deliberately. He noticed. She watched him process this and decide not to make it an issue. "You understand why I'm here," he said. "You want to assess the situation in person," she said. "You want to see the children. You want to know whether what Kaelin has reported to you is accurate, because you have been managing his affairs for some years, and you know that he is not always accurate about things that involve his emotions." A pause. "That is one way to put it. Is it an inaccurate way? Another pause, slightly longer. No. She looked at him directly. She had been thinking about this conversation since she knew he was coming. She had thought about it the way she thought about difficult cases, not with dread, but with preparation. What was the problem? What needed to be resolved? What was the correct order of approach? The problem was that Corbin's job was to protect the Alpha King's political position, and for 3 years, that position had included the documented decision to refuse a mate bond with a female from a border pack. The existence of Alpha-born twin sons, from that refused bond, was a significant complication to that record, and Corbin was here to figure out what to do with it. Her leverage was simple. She was on her ground, with her documentation, in her community, and she had been living quietly and without incident for 3 years, while filing entirely legal, if strategically incomplete paperwork. She had done nothing wrong. She had hidden nothing that she had a legal obligation to disclose. She had raised healthy, extraordinary children who were thriving. I will let you meet them, she said, because it is better for you to have accurate information than inaccurate, and because they are not secrets, they are people. You will be introduced to them as a colleague of their fathers, nothing more, and you will not raise the subject of formal registration with them, or ask them anything that puts them in the middle of a political situation they are 3 years old, and should not be managing. Corbin looked at her for a long moment. You have thought this through, he said. I have had 3 years, she said. He was quiet. The registration will happen, she said. I am not refusing it. I am determining the timeline and the manner, and I am doing so because these are my children, and the law supports my right to do exactly that. If you attempt to accelerate the timeline through any kind of pressure, formal or informal, I will go through the territory appeals process with Owen's assistance, and we will be in hearings for the better part of a year, which is not good for anyone. Including Kalen, Corbin said. Yes, she agreed, including him. You're not trying to protect him. I am trying to protect my children, she said. If the outcomes overlap, that's incidental. Another long silence. Then Corbin did something she had not expected. He sat back slightly, and the professional blankness in his expression shifted to something more human. For what it's worth, he said, and his voice was different, less formal. I told him that morning that sending me was a mistake. I told him he should go himself. She looked at him. He didn't. No, he didn't. A pause. I shouldn't have gone. I knew when I walked in that it was wrong, but I had been doing that job for 4 years, and sometimes you do the thing you have been trained to do, even when you know it isn't the right thing. She sat with this. Why are you telling me that? Because I was part of what happened, and you deserve to know that I know it, and because Kalen has been different since he came back from here the first time, and I have been his advisor long enough to know that different in his case usually means something has been set right that was wrong before. He picked up the cup she had given him and looked at it. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm telling you what I observed. She did not say anything for a moment. You'll meet them at the cottage, she said. Tonight at dinner. Kalen will be there. He nodded. Dinner that evening was crowded in a way the small kitchen table had not yet been. 4 adults, which meant Serafina on one side, Kalen beside the boys on the other, and Corbin at the end, with the particular careful posture of a man who had been told the rules and was following them precisely. Riven assessed Corbin in approximately 45 seconds and determined he was not dangerous but was stiff, which he said out loud in those words. Corbin, to his credit, said that was fair, and he was working on it, which made Riven laugh unexpectedly, and something shifted slightly at the table. Calum watched Corbin the way he watched everything, quietly and thoroughly, from his side of the table. He did not speak to him during dinner. Afterward, while Kalen and Serafina were dealing with the dishes, Calum went and sat beside Corbin on the bench near the window and looked at him for a long moment. Corbin looked back. You work for him, Calum said. I do, Corbin said. Is he good at being the king? Corbin seemed genuinely caught off guard by this. He took a breath and said, with what sounded like careful honesty, he is better at it than most people would be. He is not always good at the parts that require him to know what he wants personally. Calum nodded slowly. But he's learning? I think so, Corbin said. I think so, yes. Calum appeared satisfied with this. He got up, collected the wooden blocks he had been building with before dinner, and went to his room. Serafina had heard most of this from the kitchen. She dried the last bowl and said nothing. After Corbin had gone back to the guest lodge and the boys were in bed, she and Kaylin sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the evening. "He told me what he said to you," Kaylin said, "about that morning. I asked him not to, but he said he had already decided to." "He was right to," she said. "I know." He looked at the table. "I have been trying, for a week, to figure out how to say what I want to say to you, and I keep not finding the right way, so I'm going to say it wrong, and you can tell me where I've gotten it wrong." She waited. "I want to be here," he said. "Not to fix what happened, because I can't. Not to claim what I gave up, because I understand it's not mine to claim back. I want to be here, because these 4 days have shown me something about what I could have had, and I'm not ready to walk away from the version of it that might still be possible. But I know that version is entirely at your discretion, and I know it requires time and earning and patience, and I am prepared for all of that." She was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove clicked and settled. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the high trees. "You keep saying I know," she said. "You keep saying I understand, and I believe you when you say it. But words and actions are different categories, and I have had 3 years of proof that your words and your actions are not always the same thing." "Yes," he said. "So what I am watching," she said, "is the actions, not what you tell me you intend, what you actually do. What you do when Corbin pushes you to accelerate the registration. What you do when your counsel decides the situation needs to be managed differently. What you do in 6 months, when the immediate weight of guilt has faded, and it is just the ongoing work of being present." "That's fair," he said. "I am not asking you to promise me anything tonight," she said. "I'm asking you to do what you said. Be here. Actually be here. And I will watch." He nodded. She stood and took the last cup from the table. She put it in the basin and turned back and looked at him. "Corbin can go back to the capital tomorrow," she said. "You can stay." He looked at her. "How long?" She thought about this. She thought about the oak tree and the hedgehog. She thought about Caleb saying he crouched for a long time. She thought about Riven's 40 questions, and Kaylin answering all of them. "I don't know yet," she said. "We'll see." He stayed. Corbin went back the next morning, with a formal report that Kaylin had reviewed and approved, one that said what it needed to say, to satisfy the council's immediate concerns without creating a timeline that was not hers to set. She read it herself before he sent it. There were 2 lines she asked him to change. He changed them. That was the first time she had seen him set his council's preferences against her preferences and choose hers. She noted it without making too much of it. But she noted it. The second week was different from the first. In the first week, Kaylin had been careful in the way of someone who knows they are being evaluated. Everything he did had a slightly conscious quality, as though he were aware of being watched, and was choosing accordingly. She had understood this, and had watched for it, and had taken note of the things that slipped through the consciousness, the moments when he forgot he was being evaluated, and simply existed. In the second week, the carefulness relaxed, and what was underneath it began to show, and she found it more interesting than the careful version. He was genuinely good with Riven. Riven was a person who needed to know things. He needed to know the why behind every rule, the mechanism behind every natural event, the logic inside every social convention. Adults who could not answer his questions adequately lost his interest. Adults who answered but treated the questions as an imposition also lost his interest, more slowly but more permanently. He had a very precise internal system for deciding which adults were worth engaging with and which were to be tolerated, and it was not based on the adult's status or their affection for him. It was based entirely on whether they respected his thinking. Kaylin respected Riven's thinking. She noticed it first, on the morning she came into the kitchen, to find them at the table, with a piece of paper between them, on which Riven had drawn what appeared to be a map of the 7 territories from memory, with all the proportions wrong, and the 3rd territory impossibly large, and Kaylin was not correcting the proportions. He was asking Riven questions about why he had drawn the 3rd territory that size, and Riven was explaining, and Kaylin was listening, and then he said, quietly, "What if I show you what the proportions actually look like, and we draw it again together?" And Riven said yes immediately, in the tone of someone who has been waiting to be taken seriously. They redrew the map. It took 40 minutes. The result was still somewhat impressionistic. but the proportions were better, and Riven looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who had done a real thing. With Kalen was different, and she appreciated that he understood this was necessary, rather than defaulting to the same approach for both boys. Kalen did not want to be engaged. He wanted to be witnessed. He wanted to sit in the same space and pursue his own activities, and occasionally look up and find that the person across the room was still there, still paying attention in the peripheral way that said you matter even when you're not performing. On the fourth afternoon of the second week, Kalen sat on the floor of the living room for an hour and a half, while Kalen built an elaborate construction out of wooden blocks. Kalen did not help unless asked. He did not comment on what Kalen was building or offer suggestions. He sat with his back against the wall and his long legs stretched out, and occasionally Kalen looked up at him, and Kalen would look back, and Kalen would go back to the blocks. Serafina, working at the desk in the corner, watched this from the edges of her attention, and felt something she decided to name: relief. Not the relief of a problem solved, but the relief of something difficult turning out to be less terrible than you had feared. She had been afraid of what kind of father he would be. She had been afraid he would not know how to not be the alpha king in a room with children, that he would default to authority and direction, and the managed presence of someone performing a role. What she was finding, in the long afternoons of the second week, was that he was capable of something quieter than that. He was not perfect. There were moments when he misjudged the boys' cues, when he moved to help too quickly, or offered explanations too fully, when he forgot that 3-year-olds often need to struggle with something, rather than have it resolved. She watched these moments too, not to catalog failures, but to see how he adjusted. He adjusted. He watched their responses and recalibrated. She was someone who paid close attention to how people learned. She found that she respected how he learned. On the 12th day, Kalen's team completed their assessment of the faction situation and began preparations to leave. The advance group they had captured had been transferred to the territory's secure facility. The intelligence gathered had identified 2 more of Draven's known locations, and a larger enforcement operation was being planned at the capital level. Ashvale was no longer directly at risk. She sat with him after dinner that evening, while the boys were in bed, and she said, "Your team is leaving." "Yes, tomorrow morning." "Are you going with them?" He looked at her steadily. "I was going to ask you that question." She had been thinking about it for 2 days. She had been thinking about it the way she thought about difficult things, going around it from different angles, looking at what she actually felt, instead of what she thought she should feel. She felt, which surprised her, that she did not want him to go. She did not want him to go the way she had not wanted to leave the oak tree on the afternoon with the hedgehog, because something in the afternoon had been working, and the something was real, and she was not ready for it to stop. But she was also aware of the difference between not wanting him to go and knowing whether keeping him here was the right thing for the long term. These were 2 different assessments, and they required 2 different kinds of thinking. "I want you to go back," she said. "Deal with what needs to be dealt with at the capital. Handle Corbin and your council properly, so they are not a pressure that comes through the mail every week. Do what the Alpha King is supposed to do." He waited. "And then come back," she said. "In 2 weeks, for a long weekend. We'll see where things are." 2 weeks, he said. "The boys will know you're coming back. I'll tell them. Which means if you don't come back in 2 weeks, the conversation about that will be with them, not with me." "I will be here in exactly 2 weeks, he said. She believed him. She had enough data by now to make that assessment with reasonable confidence, and confidence was what she needed before she made promises to her children that depended on another person's follow-through. She did not offer anything more than that. She did not tell him what 2 weeks might lead to, or what she was and was not feeling. That was not information he had earned yet, and she was not going to offer it early. He understood this without being told. She could see it in the way he accepted the terms without pushing at their edges. "I'll be here," he said again. "In 2 weeks." He left the next morning with his team in the gray early light, with the mountain peaks sharp and white above Ashvale, and the village not yet fully awake. She was at the clinic by the time they left, because she had patients at 8, and she did not stand at the cottage window and watch him go. She had made that a deliberate choice. Not coldness, clarity. Riven asked that evening where he was. "Gone back to work," she said. "He'll come back in 2 weeks." 2 weeks is long, Riven said. It is, she agreed. Will he actually come? Riven asked. He asked it in the careful, practiced way that children who have learned not to expect things ask questions about things they want. She felt it in her chest. Yes, she said. I believe he will. Riven absorbed this. He went back to his book. Caleb said nothing. He was at the table with his blocks. He was building something new, something she had not seen before, taller and more complex than his usual structures. She watched him work on it for a while in silence. What are you making? She asked. He looked at it. A place, he said. Big enough for 4. She looked at the structure of blocks on the table. It was roughly the size of the cottage, if you allowed for generous interpretation. It had 4 sections, one for each of them. She sat down at the table with him and did not say anything for a while. She just sat with him while he worked. The mountain evening came in cold and quiet, and the fire ticked in the stove, and she sat with her son while he built a place big enough for 4, and the feeling she had not yet named moved through her again, this time more slowly, this time settling rather than passing. She did not name it yet, but she stopped arguing with it. He came back in exactly 2 weeks. She was on the South Forest path with the boys when she heard the vehicle on the main road, and she did not walk faster. She let the afternoon be what it was, Riven ahead on the path kicking stones with systematic interest, and Caleb beside her, with his hands in his pockets, and the mountain light filtering down through the bare branches. She had told them he was coming today. Neither of them had said much about it, which was its own kind of response. They were on the return stretch of the path, 10 minutes from the cottage, when she heard the crunch of boots on the frost-hard ground ahead, and he came around the bend in the path with his hands in his coat pockets, and the cold making his breath visible. Riven said, "Oh good," and ran forward with the complete, uncomplicated delight of a child who had not yet learned to manage his relief. Kalen crouched and caught him, and came back upright with Riven in his arms, which was remarkable given that Riven was solid and not small, and Riven was saying something about the hedgehog, and something about the map, and something about a question he had been saving for 2 weeks because he could not find the answer himself. Caleb walked forward at his normal pace and stopped in front of Kalen and looked up at him. Kalen transferred Riven to one arm, which made Riven deeply impressed, and held the other hand out to Caleb. Caleb looked at the hand, then he took it. They walked back to the cottage like that, Riven talking, Caleb holding Kalen's hand and not saying anything, and Seraphina beside them with the strange floating sensation of watching something happen that she had not planned for and had not dared to want. The long weekend was different from the first 2 weeks, in the same way that the second week had been different from the first. Each time the carefulness lessened, and the reality increased, and the reality was something she found she could bear. More than bear. She found she could enjoy it. He had brought things from the capital. Not gifts designed to impress, not expensive things chosen to make a statement. He had brought a star map for Riven, the real kind, printed on heavy paper, showing the 7 visible constellations above the northern territories in winter. He had brought Caleb a field guide to small mammals of the mountain regions, with photographs. He had brought a bag of good coffee, and this time she had said, without thinking, "You didn't need to bring the whole bag, I have some." And he had said, "I'll need it too, if I'm here for 3 days." And there had been a moment where they both processed the casual ease with which she had implied he would be using her kitchen. She did not walk back the implication. She made them both coffee and let it stand. On the first evening after dinner, she sat in the chair by the window and watched him on the floor with the boys, the star map spread between them, Riven cross-legged and leaning forward with his whole body, and Caleb lying on his stomach with his chin in his hands. Caleb was showing them how to read the map's coordinate system, and Riven was asking every question the coordinate system could produce, and Caleb was quietly pointing at the names of individual stars and asking what they meant. She had a book in her lap. She was not reading it. She was thinking about the word that had been sitting in her chest for 2 weeks without a name, and she was thinking that it had a name, and she had always known what the name was, and she had been careful about it for good reason, and the reasons were still there. But the reasons were living alongside something else now, something that had been building in the long afternoons, and the dinners and the forest paths, and the 2 things were not incompatible. The care and the feeling, the watching and the finding. She was 31 years old. She was a healer who had run a clinic in a mountain town for 3 years. She had raised two extraordinary children on her own, and had built a life that she was proud of, and that was real. She was not someone who made decisions without thinking them through. She was not someone who chose comfort over clarity. She was also not someone who decided to be unhappy when happiness was available in a form she could trust. She looked at him on the floor with her sons. She thought about 2 weeks of watching. She thought about the map redrawn with Riven, the hedgehog afternoon with Calum, the modified council report, the Corbin conversation, all of it. She thought about Calum building a place big enough for 4. She thought about the mate bond, which had not gone away, which was still there in her chest, at a frequency she had learned to live with, the way you live with a chronic, non-harmful condition, something you stop noticing until a certain kind of quiet brings it back. It was back now, in this warm living room on a November evening, and it was not a demand, it was just there, the way it had always been there. She picked up her book. Later, after the boys were in bed, she found him in the kitchen making tea. He looked up when she came in, and moved slightly to give her access to the counter without being asked, the unconscious consideration of someone who had spent enough time in a space to have learned its natural movements. "The Capital Council meeting went well?" she said. She had not asked yet. "Well enough," he said. Corbin performed what he calls a controlled presentation, which means he told them what they needed to know, in a way that did not immediately produce 18 emergency opinions. And the opinions that did emerge? Manageable. Most of them are concerned about the registration timeline. 2 of them are concerned about the political implications of the situation generally. He set the kettle down. One of them asked whether you would be amenable to a formal arrangement. She looked at him. What kind of arrangement? "The kind that would be beneficial to the council's long-term planning," he said, in a tone that made very clear what he thought of the council's long-term planning. "What did you say?" "I said that arrangements were not on the table, and that the council's job was to support decisions I made, not to propose them." She turned to look out the dark kitchen window. "That's going to cause friction. It already has." A pause. "That's fine. I'd rather have friction there than have you feeling like you are being managed." She stayed at the window for a moment. "Are you always this direct with them?" "Not previously," he said. "I am finding it more effective than I expected." She turned back. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, not in a closed way but in the way of someone who is comfortable where they are. The kitchen lamp was low, and the night outside was dark and very quiet, and the cottage around them was settled and warm. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want a direct answer, not a managed one." "Ask," he said. "What do you actually want? Not for the council, not for the territories, not for whatever function a formal arrangement serves. What do you want personally, from this?" He looked at her for a long time. She could see him deciding how to answer, not managing the answer but ordering it, finding the clearest words for something that was large. "I want what I see in this cottage," he said. "Not the version that fits the council's picture of what the Alpha King's household should look like, this version. These boys, this kitchen, you. I want the chance to be a part of something real." She absorbed this. "That's the thing about what you're asking for," she said. "Real is the word that matters. Real means not leaving when Corbin pushes. Real means not adjusting who you are in here, based on what is convenient out there. Real means being present when there is nothing dramatic happening, when it's just Riven's questions, and Calum's quiet, and the ordinary work of being a family." "I know," he said. "Do you?" She said it without sharpness. "Because you have had 2 weeks of the version that is new and interesting. I need to know if you understand that the rest of it is the part that never becomes new." He was quiet for a long moment. "I spent 2 weeks at the Capitol," he said, "dealing with the version of my life that was already in place before I came to Ashvale, and I spent every day of those 2 weeks thinking about the South Bend oak, and the hedgehog, and Calum's blocks, and the dinner table, not thinking about it as something I missed. Thinking about it as something I was going to come back to." He met her eyes. "I understand what ordinary is. I have been living without it for a long time. I don't find it small." She believed him. She had been watching for 2 weeks, and she believed him. And the caution in her was not gone, but it was no longer the loudest thing in the room. She pushed off from the counter. She walked past him to the door, and then stopped. "You can stay through the week if you want," she said. "Not the long weekend. The week." She did not turn around to see his face. She did not need to. She went to bed. In the morning he was still there, which was what she had said and also more than that, and when she came to the kitchen at 6 the fire was already built up and the kettle was on, and he was at the table with a cup and Riven's star map, tracing something on it with one finger. He looked up when she came in. She said nothing. She poured hot water into her cup and sat down across from him at the table. They sat in the early morning quiet of the kitchen, while the light came up and the mountain went from dark to pale to white, and it was ordinary, and it was real, and she let herself have it. The week stretched into 10 days, and she did not say anything about it. On the 6th day, the formal registration request arrived from the territory office. Not a demand, but a notice, the kind that signaled that the administrative process had been initiated, and that response was expected within 60 days. She read it at the clinic, set it on Nora's old desk, and went back to her patient. That evening she showed it to Kalen. He read it without expression, and set it back on the table and said, "You know what you want to do with it." "I know what the process is," she said. "I want to understand what the implications are of each option before I decide." They talked through it for an hour. Him, with a knowledge of the territory's formal systems she did not have, and her, with the documentation she had built up over 3 years. The outcome of the conversation was a plan she was comfortable with. She would respond to the notice within the 30-day window, initiating a modified registration process that acknowledged paternity, without triggering the full formal recognition protocol until she approved it. This was legal. It was not the standard path, but it was not outside the law, and Owen's contact in the territory legal office had confirmed it. Kalen agreed to this without negotiating. She had expected some version of his counsel's position to come through, some soft mention of what would be easier for the formal record. It did not come. She noticed that. She added it to the list of things she was watching. On the 8th day, Owen came to the cottage for dinner. She had invited him deliberately. She wanted Owen to spend time with Kalen in a context that was not official or structured, and she wanted to see how Kalen was with someone whose respect could not be commanded. Owen was 82 years old and had lived through 3 territory wars and 2 leadership transitions, and he had the specific immunity to authority that very old people acquire when they have outlasted everyone who once held power over them. Owen arrived at 6 with a bottle of something he had made himself from mountain berries, which he said was not exactly wine, but was not exactly not wine either, and he sat at the table and accepted dinner and talked about the town's water system for 20 minutes, in the particular Ashvale style that assumed you were interested regardless of who you were. Kalen was interested. She could see that it was genuine. He asked questions about the system's source and its winter maintenance needs, the practical questions of someone who was actually listening. Owen answered them with growing approval. By the end of dinner, Owen had told Kalen 3 things about Serafina that she would not have told him herself, all of them accurate and none of them comfortable. He told him about her first winter in Ashvale, which had been genuinely difficult, the money running out by February, and the second-hand coat that was not warm enough, and the fact that she had not told anyone, and had simply worked through it. He told him about the night in her first year, when one of the clinic's emergency cases had been a pup in serious distress, and she had worked for 6 hours, and saved the pup's life, and then sat in the clinic alone for the rest of the night, because there was no one to go home to. He told him about the moment he had realized she was someone Ashvale would protect, which was the morning after Draven's raid, when she was back at the clinic at 8 o'clock, and told every patient who came in that the town was all right, and that she was all right, and she was entirely convincing until she thought no one was watching. Owen told these stories calmly, with the tone of someone delivering information they thought was relevant. He looked at Kalen when he finished and said, with no softening, "You should know what she's made of, and you should know what it costs to be made of it." Kalen held Owen's gaze and said, "I know, or I am beginning to." Owen looked at him for a moment longer. Then he poured more of the not-quite wine and said to Serafina, "He'll do," in the tone of a final assessment. She was going to argue, and then decided not to. After Owen left and the boys were asleep, she said to Kalen, "You didn't flinch." "From what?" "From Owen's stories. Some people get defensive when they're being shown the cost of their actions." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 2 years after that morning, telling myself the decision made sense," he said. "I spent the 3rd year, running out of arguments for why it made sense. By the time Dax's report came in, I wasn't defending it anymore. I was just living with it." He looked at the table. Owen's stories didn't tell me something new. They showed me the shape of something I already knew was there. She sat with this. How did you live with it? She asked, not accusing, genuinely curious about the mechanics of it. Badly, he said. I worked more. I told myself the territories needed what I was giving them. I held every council meeting and signed every order and went to every regional gathering, and I was very present and very effective and extremely alone in the way that people are alone when they have made themselves into a function rather than a person. She absorbed this. She had been alone in a different way. The alone of starting over in a mountain town with no connections and no safety net, and 2 children growing inside her, and a healer's knowledge that had made her useful before she had made herself anything else. Her alone had been practical and full of motion. His, it seemed, had been the opposite. I'm not telling you that to generate sympathy, he said, apparently reading her expression. I'm telling you because you asked. I know, she said. I know the difference. She stood up and took the last cup to the basin. She stood at the basin for a moment, with her hands on the edge of it, looking at nothing. Then she turned around. He was sitting at the table, watching her, with the careful attention he had given to all of this since the beginning, the attention that did not demand or direct, that simply witnessed. The mate bond, she said. Do you still feel it? A pause. Yes. It never broke, she said, even after 3 years. It quieted, but it didn't break. I know, he said. Mine either. She nodded. I'm not ready to act on it, she said. I want to be clear about that. Whatever this is becoming, it is not moving at the speed of a bond. It is moving at the speed of trust, which is slower. I understand that. Do you have the patience for slower? He looked at her steadily. I have been not here for 3 years, he said. I have patience for as long as slower takes. She held his gaze for a long moment. 10 more days, she said, before you have to go back. You can stay for 10 more days, if your council can manage without you. They can manage, he said. They are capable people. They have simply been trained to believe they cannot. She almost smiled at that. She turned back to the basin and finished washing the cup. Tomorrow, she said, Calum wants to go to the South Bend. He's been checking on the hedgehog every 2 days, and he wants to see if it's still there. Then I'll come, Kaelin said. We leave at 4, she said, before the light drops. I'll be ready. She dried her hands and went to bed. She lay in the dark, and the mountain was cold outside the window, and the cottage was warm, and the boys were asleep down the hall, and something had shifted in the last 2 hours, in the direction of something she had not been ready to want, and was now finding she could not entirely stop wanting. She did not panic about this. She had long since learned that wanting something was not the same as being controlled by it. She wanted. She was watching. Both things were true. She went to sleep. A month passed. Then 2. Kaelin came to Ashvale every 2 weeks, staying between 5 and 10 days each time, depending on what the capital required. He had found a system, she gathered, of working ahead of his schedule, so that the gaps his absence created were already filled before he left. His council was not happy with this arrangement, but they were adapting to it, which was what councils did when the person they advised had decided. She watched the system work. She watched how he came back each time. The first return had been charged with something, the effort of 2 weeks apart and the awareness of everything that had and had not been said. By the 4th return it was quieter, more like arrival than return, the particular ease of someone coming back to a place they know. She noticed this and said nothing about it. She was still watching. Riven had, by the 6th week of Kaelin's presence in his life, developed a relationship with him that had its own complete logic. He treated Kaelin as a peer who was, regrettably, much older and therefore less efficient, but who compensated for this by knowing a great many things that Riven wanted to know. Kaelin accepted this characterization without argument. They had a running project about star navigation that had started with the paper map and had expanded to include an actual compass and a chart that Riven was maintaining with terrible handwriting and great seriousness. With Kaelin had found something different and finer, a kind of companionship that existed in quiet. They spent time together in ways that did not require event or conversation. They were both readers. On the evenings, when Riven was occupied with something physical, and Serafina was at the desk, and the cottage was warm and still, Kaelin would be in the armchair with a text, and Caleb would be on the floor with his field guide, and the room would simply breathe around them. She sat at the desk on one of those evenings, not working, watching them without making it obvious, and she thought about a word she had been carefully avoiding. She had been calling it trust. She had been calling it watching. She had been calling it a process, which was accurate, and she had been calling it the speed of trust, which was also accurate. What she had not been calling it was what it was, which was something she had not expected to feel again after the bathroom floor, and the bus rides, and the 3 years of building without safety nets. She trusted him. That was true, and it was earned. But this was more than trust. This was the thing that had tried to exist in a gold-lit hall 3 years ago, and had been stopped. The thing that the mate bond had been carrying all along, patient in the way that genuine things are patient, not disappearing just because the door was closed but sitting against it quietly, waiting for the moment when the door was opened from the inside. She was opening the door from the inside. She had known this was coming for the past 3 weeks, and she had been, for the first time since she was 21, not afraid of it. Just deliberate. Just herself. She told him on a Wednesday evening, in December, when the mountains outside the cottage window were white, and the boys were asleep, and the fire was going, and the kitchen was warm. He was at the table with the star chart, making a correction Riven had requested. She was washing the last of the dinner things. She dried her hands. She turned around. She said, "I have been falling in love with you for about 6 weeks, and I want you to know that, and I also want you to know it doesn't change my terms." He set down the pen. He looked at her with those amber-green eyes that were not managed and not careful right now. They were just his. "Say it again," he said, very quietly. "I said I have been falling in love with you," she said, "and it doesn't change my terms. This is still my home, and my clinic, and my boys, and my decisions. I am not offering you authority over any of that. What I am offering is something I have not offered anyone in 3 years, which is being honest about what I feel, and what I feel is that." He stood up from the table. He did not move toward her. He stood and looked at her from across the kitchen, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, which was being entirely open, without any of the management she had grown accustomed to seeing him navigate in and out of. He looked like a man who had not expected to be this lucky, and was not entirely sure what to do with it. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to find the moment to say it for 3 weeks, and I couldn't find the right one, which means I was waiting for the wrong thing, because the right one is just any moment you're standing in front of me." She absorbed this. "I'm aware," she said, "that those are words. I'm still watching the actions." "I know," he said. "I'm also aware that I just told a man I have a complicated history with, that I love him, which is arguably not the most strategically careful thing I have ever done." "Probably not," he agreed. "But I decided," she said, "a long time ago, to be honest about real things when they were real, and this is real." He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her with the same careful attention to space he had always had in this small room, not crowding her, not assuming. He looked at her. She reached up and put her hand on his face. Just that. Just her palm against his jaw and his eyes on hers. The mate bond, which had been a quiet, constant presence in her chest for 3 years, did something she had not expected. It did not roar back to life the way she had anticipated. It settled, like a sound that has been at a certain volume for a long time, finally reaching the level it was always supposed to be at. It was not a storm, it was more like coming home. She let her hand drop. She stepped back. He let her, because he always let her, because that was one of the things she had been watching for, and he had never once been wrong about it. "The council is going to have opinions," she said. "They always have opinions," he said. "What are you going to tell them?" He thought about this with genuine seriousness, not performing the answer. "I'm going to tell them that the situation in Ashvale has developed in a way that reflects well on the territories, and that the registration process is proceeding appropriately, and that the matter of the Alpha's personal life is not a matter for council determination." "And the rest of it?" "The rest of it," he said, "is mine, and yours, and not theirs." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the mountain winter was complete and still, and the cottage was warm, and down the hall her sons were sleeping with the total security of children who have never doubted they are safe. She had built that safety, stone by stone, choice by choice, bus ride by bus ride, She had built it without him, and she was not going to pretend she had needed him to build it. But she was building what came next. And what came next, she was building differently. "There's one more thing," she said. "Tell me." "I am not going to your court," she said. "Whatever this becomes, whatever the registration says, and whatever your council wants, I live in Ashvale. Riven and Calum grow up in Ashvale. This is where my clinic is, and where Owen is, and where the South Bend Oak is, and where Grove the Hedgehog spends the winter. If you want a family, you learn what this town is, and you come to it." "I know," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. "I want you to tell me you understand what that means. Not a general yes. Tell me specifically." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It means I travel. It means I arrange my schedule around a town that is 4 hours from the capital by road. It means my sons go to school in Asheville, and their address is an Asheville address, and when people ask where they live, they say a mountain town, not the capital. It means I come to you, not the other way around. Every time." She was quiet. "Does it mean more than that?" he asked. She thought about it. "It means when Corbin calls, and it's between finishing what you're doing here and being back in time for his meeting, you finish what you're doing here." She nodded. "Then we're clear." She turned and went back to putting things away on the shelf, the ordinary end of evening things, because the conversation was done and the evening needed to finish the way evenings finished, with the practical and the quiet. He helped. He put the star chart away and straightened the chairs at the table and banked the fire for the night, the things you do when you know where things go, and it is not a question anymore. When it was done, she stood in the kitchen in the lamplight and said, "You can stay for the rest of the week." "I know," he said. She went to check on the boys. Riven was already sprawled wide with his arm over his head. Calum had curled himself neatly with his blanket to his chin. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself feel the weight of what she had built in this cottage, in this town, in 3 years of choosing one thing at a time, with no one to catch her if she fell. Then she let herself feel something else too, the weight of what might be built next, with more hands, and more time, and the kind of love that had been patient enough to wait. Both things were true. That was the thing about real life. 2 true things could live in the same chest without fighting. She turned off the hallway light. She went to bed. Outside, the mountain night was cold and enormous, and completely still. January came in hard, the way mountain winters come in when they have been waiting for permission, with ice on every path and 3 days of heavy snow that closed the main road from the capital and kept Calum in Asheville a week longer than planned. She did not find this inconvenient. He shoveled the path between the cottage and the clinic every morning, which she had not asked him to do, and which she accepted without making much of it, because she was trying to stop cataloging everything he did correctly, and simply let correct become expected. The shift from checking to trusting. She was practicing it. The boys thought the extended stay was the best thing that had happened in recent memory. Riven was particularly pleased because it meant Calum was available for the star observation they had been planning for a clear night, which the snowstorm eventually provided when it broke on the 4th evening and left the sky extraordinarily clear and cold. They bundled up and stood in the cottage garden at 9 o'clock, all 4 of them with their breath-making clouds, and Riven navigated by the chart he had been maintaining for 2 months, and found the 3 constellations he had been looking for, with a precision that made Calum go quiet for a moment, in the way that meant something had surprised him. Calum stood beside Serafina, with his shoulder against her arm, and tilted his head back and looked at the sky. He did not name what he was looking at. He was just looking. "Which one is your favorite?" she asked. He thought about it. "The one that's brightest," he said. "Not because it's biggest, because it's been there longest." She looked at him. He was looking at the sky. She thought about that for a while. A 3-year-old's understanding of constancy. She thought it was not so different from what she was learning about trust. The council's next communication arrived in January, while the roads were still closing regularly, and travel was difficult. It was a formal letter, not from Corbin this time, but from the full council body, requesting a meeting to discuss what they called the formalization of the recognized familial situation of the Alpha King. She read it twice, then she called Calum. He was in the kitchen when she found him. She handed him the letter. He read it. His expression was very controlled, which was how she knew he was working to keep it controlled. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I want you to tell me honestly what the pressure looks like from inside your position, she said. Not what you think I can handle, what it actually looks like. He set the letter on the table. The council is nervous. The territories have not had a formal recognition of the Alpha King's heirs in 2 years, because the position of Luna has been empty, and there are 7 packs in 7 territories who are watching for signals about stability. The existence of 2 unrecognized Alpha Sons is a signal. Not a bad one necessarily, but an unresolved one, and unresolved things make councils nervous. So they want a formal arrangement, she said. Yes, they want registration completed, and they want a public acknowledgement. And then? He looked at her steadily. They want me to bring you to the capital. She had expected this. She had been waiting for this to arrive since the first day. She had thought about it carefully, and she had her answer prepared, and the answer had not changed since she gave the same answer to herself in the kitchen 2 months ago. No, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him. You already told them no. I told them it was your decision, and that I would relay their request, which I'm doing now. I've told them my position, which is that I support whatever you decide. She picked up the letter and folded it. What happens if I say no publicly? What does it mean for you? Some political complexity, he said. Nothing I can't manage. Kalen. She used his name with the specific tone that said she wanted the real answer. It creates a narrative that some people will use, he said. That the Alpha King's mate refused the court. That there is division. That the situation is unstable. A pause. Some people will use it to suggest I should formalize things through other means. That if you won't come to court, there are other ways to structure the Alpha's household. She held his gaze. Other means meaning a political match. Yes. And you will tell them. I'll tell them that is not a conversation we are having, he said. There is no other means. There is this. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about all the things she had learned in 3 years to not be afraid of. She thought about Corbin's form, and the bus rides, and the cold February of the first winter, and the 6 hours with the pup in the clinic. She thought about what she had built and what it cost, and why it was worth the cost. She thought about Owen saying, "Come to me first." She thought about Calum, looking at the sky, saying, "The one that's been there longest." She picked up the letter and went to the desk. She sat down and found a piece of paper and wrote the response herself, in her own hand, in her own words, which she had never felt she needed to make large or official, but which she knew now should be both. She wrote that registration would be completed in February, through the modified process they had already begun. She wrote that she and her sons would not be relocating to the capital, and that this was a decision already made, and not subject to further discussion. She wrote that the Alpha King's relationship with his children and with her was developing in the way that was appropriate for the people involved, and that the council's timeline was not a factor in that development. She wrote that if any council member wished to raise the subject further, they were welcome to submit their concerns in writing to the Alpha King, who would evaluate them and respond according to his own judgment. She signed her full name. She did not add any title. She gave it to Kalen to read. He read it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Can I add one line?" She gave him the pen. He added a line at the bottom, below her signature, in his own handwriting. "These decisions are final." Below that, he signed his name. She looked at their 2 signatures on the same piece of paper. "Send it today," she said. He sent it. The council responded 3 days later. The response was formal and somewhat stiff, and acknowledged her position, while making 3 suggestions about voluntary relocation that were worded as suggestions, but clearly were not. Kalen replied to those 3 suggestions with the same line 3 times. Respectfully declined. She heard about this afterward and said, "Was that actually necessary? 3 times?" "It felt appropriate," he said, and she actually laughed. She had not laughed easily in a long time. She noticed that about herself now, the way laughter was coming back. Not loud or frequent, but present. The particular kind of laughter that comes from something being actually funny, rather than the polite kind she had been using for 3 years with patients and neighbors when a laugh was expected. The registration was completed in February. She drove to the territory office herself, with Owen as her witness, and the paperwork she had been preparing for months. The forms were precise and clear, and said exactly what they said, and when the clerk looked up at the name in the father's field, and then looked at her, she met his eyes without expression, and waited for him to finish processing the document. He finished. He stamped it. He handed her the copies. Riven and Calum were now formally registered. Their names were in the territory record. Their father's name was in the territory record. The record existed, and was real, and she had controlled every aspect of how it came to exist. She drove home with Owen in the passenger seat, who said nothing for the first 20 minutes, and then said, "How does it feel?" She thought about it. "Like something that's been open is closed," she said. "Not finished, just closed." Owen nodded. "That's usually what done feels like," he said. She drove the mountain road back to Ashvale, through the February afternoon, with the mountains white above the tree line and the road clear and the town waiting ahead, and she thought that done was a good word for it. Not finished. Done with the fear. Done with the waiting for someone to come and take what she had built. Done with holding it all alone. Ready for what came next. Spring came to Ashvale the way spring comes to mountain towns, not all at once but in pieces. A warm afternoon here, and a mud-softened path there. The creek at the edge of town running louder, as the snow on the upper peaks began to move. The boys were 4 in February, and the way they experienced the spring was by being entirely in it, always outside, always moving, with the forest paths and the creek bank and the cottage garden as their territory. She watched them from the clinic window sometimes, on the afternoons when she had a lull and could stand for 5 minutes with a cup of tea and look at the world. In those 5 minutes, if Kalen was in Ashvale, which he was more often than not now, she would see him out there with them, not managing the outdoor time or directing it, just present, the way he had learned to be present with them, in the way of each one specifically. With Riven, he moved. They were often in motion together, walking the paths at Riven's pace, which was fast and decisive, or up on the cleared rise above the town where Riven had discovered you could see 4 peaks at once if you stood in exactly the right spot. Kalen would stand beside him on the rise and let Riven point out the peaks he had named, which were not their official names, but the names Riven had given them, names like the Broken One, and the Tall Quiet, and the one that looks like a shoulder. With Calum, he was still. They would be in the garden when the weather allowed, or in the cottage, with Calum's current project, which had shifted from wooden blocks to a careful survey of all the living things in the cottage garden. He was recording this in a notebook, with drawings that were not bad for a 4-year-old who was learning to hold a pencil with the seriousness of someone who intended to use pencils for a long time. Kalen would sit on the low garden wall and watch, and occasionally Calum would bring him something to look at, a beetle or a root or a section of bark, and Kalen would look at it with the same attention he gave to the council reports he brought north with him, because by now he had learned that Calum knew the difference. Serafina's clinic hours were expanding. Nora's health had continued to decline slowly through the winter, and she had formally retired in March, which made the clinic Serafina's in every way that mattered. She hired a part-time assistant, a young man named Leon, who had 2 years of healer training and excellent hands and a calm disposition. The clinic's patient list grew through the spring, as word spread in the way word spreads in mountain communities, through the people who had been treated well and said so to other people in hardware stores and bakeries. She was busy. She understood with some surprise, happy. Not the fragile kind that she had been careful about since the bathroom floor, the kind you held lightly because it might be temporary. The other kind, the kind that sits in your body differently, that breathes deeper, that makes ordinary mornings feel like they have a particular quality of light, the kind you can trust. On a Saturday morning in April, she came into the kitchen at 7 to find that Kalen had made breakfast, and all 3 of them were already at the table. Riven with his compass doing something to the star chart that involved a ruler, Calum with his notebook, and Kalen with a cup and the territory news he had brought up from the capital and had apparently already read because it was folded to a specific page. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the 3 of them at the table in the spring morning light. The thing she felt was not complicated. It was simple, the way true things are simple, underneath all the complexity that living with them requires. She loved them. All 3 of them in this kitchen on a Saturday morning were her people, and she loved them, and it was the uncomplicated center of everything else. She made tea. She sat down at the table. She picked up the section of the news Kalen was done with. Riven said, without looking up, "Kalen showed me how to use the compass with the chart. You can find your position if you know 2 fixed stars." "Can you?" she said. I found ours, he said. He pointed to a mark on the chart. That's Ashvale. We're right there. She looked at the mark. Good navigation, she said. He's better at it than I was at his age, Kaelin said, with the plain tone of a fact rather than a compliment. Riven absorbed this with satisfaction and went back to the chart. Caleb said, still looking at his notebook. There are 7 different insects in the garden now. There were 4 last week. Spring is coming in, she said. Yes, he said. I think Grove woke up. I heard something in the South Bend area yesterday. We should check, she said. After breakfast, he said, with the manner of someone who has learned to sequence things properly. She looked across the table at Kaelin. He was looking at her with the expression that she had stopped cataloging weeks ago, because it was simply what his face did now. The open, unmanaged version. The one that had taken 3 years and many careful months to arrive at. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her tea and the news and the morning. After breakfast, they went to the South Bend. All 4 of them, in the spring morning with the light clear and the creek running loud in the near distance, and the path soft with the thaw. Riven went ahead, because he always went ahead. Kaelin walked beside Seraphina. Kaelin walked on her other side. They rounded the bend, and Kaelin crouched at the oak roots with his slow, careful approach, the one she had taught him from healing work, the way you move near something small and easily startled. He looked into the hollow for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at them with his most serious expression. Grove is awake, he said. They crouched around the hollow. There was movement in the dark, small and definite, and then the unmistakable shape of Grove emerged partway and blinked at the morning, with the expression of a creature that has decided, after considerable deliberation, that spring has actually arrived. Riven went entirely still, which was so unusual that Seraphina glanced at him. He was looking at the hedgehog with the focused wonder of a child who has forgotten to be loud. Caleb said, very softly, "She made it." "She did," Seraphina said. They stayed at the oak for 10 minutes, watching Grove investigate the edge of the roots and eventually decide that the world was acceptable and begin her slow, determined movement along the base of the trunk. Caleb watched with the attention of a healer's child, noting behavior and recording it later. Riven watched with the attention of a person who has just been given something they were not expecting. On the walk back, Riven was quiet for almost 3 whole minutes, which was, in her experience, a personal record. Then he said, "Do hedgehogs know they're going to wake up again in spring, when they go to sleep?" "I don't think so," Seraphina said. "I think they go because it's time, and they wake up because it's time." Riven thought about this. "That seems like a good way to work," he said. "Just trust that it works." She looked at her son. "Yes," she said. "It is." At the edge of the path where it opened back to the cottage garden, Kaelin stopped, and she stopped beside him, and they watched the boys go ahead through the gate, Riven already in motion, and Caleb close behind with his notebook, and the April morning was on everything, the light and the cold and the beginning of warmth underneath it. "I want to ask you something," Kaelin said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that there is only one right answer, and the right answer is whatever you say." She looked at him. "I want to know," he said, "if what we are building here has a name yet, for you. Not a formal name, not a council name, just yours." She thought about this. She thought about how she had avoided naming things for a long time, and how the avoiding had been right for the right period, and was no longer necessary. "It has a name," she said. He waited. "It's called what I was afraid to want," she said, "and now I'm not afraid of it anymore." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That's a good name." "It is," she said. "I'll probably shorten it eventually." He almost smiled. She turned and walked through the gate into the cottage garden, where Caleb was already crouched at the edge of the bed, examining something with great focus, and Riven was attempting to use the compass to determine which direction the kitchen door faced. She heard Caleb come through the gate behind her. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She knew he was there, and that knowledge sat in her chest, in the place the mate bond had always lived, no longer separate from everything else, just part of the whole thing, part of the warm and ordinary reality of a Saturday morning in Ashvale, in April, with her people around her. She had built this, not quickly and not easily, and not because anything had been given to her. She had built it choice by choice, in the dark and in the cold, on a bathroom floor, and on bus rides north, and in a mountain town she had found, because the road was iced over. She had built it, and it was real, and it was hers. And now, slowly, carefully, entirely on her own terms, she was building what came after. In the kitchen, Nora's old herbs were still hanging from the ceiling. The star chart was still on the kitchen table. Caleb's first notebook was on the shelf next to Gerald's field guide she had brought from Caldwell Creek, the one she had never been able to leave behind. She went inside. She put the kettle on. Outside, her sons were in the spring morning, and the person she had been afraid to want was in the garden, and the mountain was white above the trees, and the creek was running, and Ashevale was entirely itself, small and high, and permanent, in the way that places become permanent when enough living has happened in them. She had walked away 3 years ago with nothing but a single bag and a decision, and the quiet impossible thing growing inside her that had become everything. She had not been looking back. She was not looking back now. She poured the water, and the morning settled around her, and she was home. May arrived, and the clinic was busy, in the way spring clinics are always busy, with the injuries that come from people deciding simultaneously that winter is over, and everything should be done immediately. Serafina and Leon worked through a long Tuesday of sprained wrists, and a child who had fallen from a fence, and one older wolf who had decided to clear his entire woodpile in a single afternoon, and whose back had strong opinions about this plan. She came home at 6 to find the cottage warm, dinner already started, and the boys in the garden with Kalen, who was on his knees in the soft earth, helping Caleb transplant something from one section of the garden to another. Riven was sitting on the wall, watching this, with the patience of someone who finds the activity uninteresting, but finds the people in the activity worth observing. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, just standing, just looking. Leon had said something to her that day that she had been carrying since afternoon. He had said it without meaning anything in particular by it, as an observation rather than a comment, because Leon was that kind of person. He had said, in the middle of filing, you seem different lately, not busier, lighter. She had thought about lighter for the rest of the afternoon. It was the right word for something she had been feeling without naming, the specific quality of having set down something heavy, not so you could pick it up again later, but because you had found, finally, that you did not need to carry it anymore. She had been carrying the refusal for 3 years. Not consciously, not in the way of someone nursing a wound, in the way of someone who has reorganized their whole body around an absence, who has learned to move and work and build, with a particular part of themselves held away from contact, because contact with that part hurt. She had been carrying it so long she had stopped noticing it was there. It was not there anymore. She went out to the garden. Kalen looked up when she came through the door, and his face did the thing it did now, the uncomplicated, unguarded thing. She had stopped cataloging it weeks ago. She had stopped doing a lot of the careful measuring and noting that had been necessary, when things were new and fragile. Things were not fragile anymore. They were solid, in the way that things are solid when they have been tested and they have held. Riven said, Leon sent a message saying a family from the Second Valley is coming Friday for a consultation. He said to tell you it's 2 adults and 3 children, and one of the children has a complicated situation. How do you know that? She asked. He sent the message to the clinic number, and Kalen read it aloud, and I listened, Riven said, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious. She looked at Kalen. I thought it was probably relevant, he said. It is, she said. She turned to go back inside to write it down, and then paused. Thank you. He was watching her. She watched him back for a moment, in the spring evening light, with the garden around them, and the mountains above the tree line going golden. She had thought, once, that the thing that broke first was the hardest to rebuild. She had thought that the refusal in the gold-lit hall had done something irreversible, something that had closed a door she could not open again. She had believed that for 3 years, and she had built a life that proved the belief wrong, not because she had tried to prove it wrong, but because building was what she did, and eventually the building led her somewhere the belief could not follow. She went inside. She wrote the Friday note. She took the vegetables from the cold store for dinner and began cutting them. Through the kitchen window she could see all 3 of them in the garden, Caleb showing Kalen what he had planted, and Riven, who had apparently decided the conversation was now interesting enough to join, crouching beside them with his compass still in hand. The boys would start school in September. Ashvale's school was small and good, and Riven had been asking about it for months, in the way he asked about anything that represented more information becoming available to him. Calum had asked 2 questions about it, and then appeared to have made an internal decision he had not shared. She knew that manner. He would be fine. Kalen would not be here every day in September. He would be here as often as he could arrange, which was significant, and the gaps between his visits were what they were, and she and the boys had a life that did not stop when he was absent. That was important. She had made it important from the beginning, because she knew the difference between a family that needed a person and a family that wanted one, and she wanted her boys to grow up knowing the difference too. They came inside for dinner as the light dropped. The table was set with 4 places, which had been normal for months. Riven sat down and opened a conversation about something he had read in the Star Guide that morning. Calum sat beside Serafina and looked at the food with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has had a good day. Kaylin poured water for all 4 glasses, the last person to sit, and she noticed, as she often noticed now, the small choices that accumulated into a pattern, the way he occupied a shared space rather than commanded it. He poured water before he sat. He passed things before he served himself. He asked before he spoke over Riven, and waited until there was a natural pause. She had watched these things for months, and they had not changed. They were not performances anymore, if they had ever been. They were just how he was in this kitchen, in this life. Dinner was loud because Riven made dinner loud, and this was fine. Calum contributed precisely 2 observations and several expressions. Kaylin talked to both of them, with the differentiated attention she had watched him develop over months of evenings. After dinner, the boys helped clear the table in the manner of 4-year-olds helping, which meant Riven carried things with great confidence, and occasionally set them in the wrong place, and Calum carried each thing with careful precision, and put it exactly where it belonged. Then the boys were in bed, and the kitchen was quiet, and she and Kaylin were at the table with the last of the tea, in the familiar evening quiet of the cottage. He had territory papers with him. He often brought work north because there was no separating the work from him entirely, and she had stopped expecting the separation, and started expecting the integration, the way you integrate any honest reality into a life. He did not open them. He was looking at her. "What did Leon say that you've been thinking about?" he asked. She looked at him. "How do you know I've been thinking about something?" "You've had a particular face since you came in from the clinic," he said. "Not worried. Somewhere else." She considered this. Then she said, "He said I seem lighter." Kaylin was quiet. "He was right," she said. He held her gaze. "Good," he said. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands around the cup. She thought about everything that had been in those hands over the past 4 years. The bag on the bus, the testing stick on the bathroom floor, the paperwork for the Ashvale clinic lease, the registration form in February, with his name in the father's field for the first time. The work of 4 years in the hands of one person, done without a net. "I want to say something," she said. He waited the way he had learned to wait, without filling the space. "I was wrong about one thing," she said. "One thing. In all of this. I thought that doing it alone was the only way to keep it mine. I thought that letting someone in meant ceding something I could not get back." She paused. "I was wrong about that. What I have now is more mine than it was before, not less. Because I chose it. All of it. Including you." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured in the way it was when something had moved through him that he was not letting move visibly. "I know," he said, "that I do not deserve the version of you who is sitting here saying that. I know what the version of me from 4 years ago cost you, and I know it took everything you had to build your way here, without any help from me." He looked at her. "But I am going to spend a very long time trying to be worth it." She looked at him across the table. In the kitchen lamplight, in the cottage she had built in the mountain town, she had found, because a road was iced over. "You already are," she said, "starting from now." Something in him settled. She could see it. The same settling she had felt when the mate bond finally came to rest, after 3 years of being a quiet ache, everything finding the level it was always supposed to be at. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She held it there. He turned his hand under hers and held on, simply and without anything being performed. Outside, the mountain spring was moving toward summer. The creek was full and fast, and the forest above the town was green and very much alive. Grove the hedgehog was somewhere in the South Bend oak's roots, awake and about her business. Riven and Calum were asleep down the hall in the room where they had slept since they were small enough to need the crib that Nora had given her in the first winter. The cottage was warm and real and entirely hers, and she was in it, and he was in it, and the morning would come the way mornings come, with the light moving across the kitchen floor, and the kettle on, and the world ordinary and good. She was not afraid of ordinary. She had learned that ordinary, built with intention and held with honesty, was the most extraordinary thing in the world. She had walked away once, with nothing but the truth of what she carried, and she had turned that into this. She was not walking anywhere now. She was home.